forming the African American History Task Force and then put it into law without asking their opinions or anything. Dr. Donna Austin, who is a member of the actual African American History Task Force in the state of Florida, said it's the same divide techniques that they used on the plantation. It's the same identical thing. They always use methods of dividing the African and African American people. That's what they do. Apparently, some of the members on DeSantis' hand-picked task force are also black. For example, this is a quote from Social Studies 2023 standards. Quote, examine the various duties and trades performed by slaves like agricultural work, painting, carpentry, tailoring, domestic service, blacksmithing, and transportation. Instruction includes how slaves develop skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. End of quote. This rather flipped out these people. Another was, famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass was inspired by his mistress to read while enslaved. That small glimmer of light was enough to inspire him to turn it into a burning flame of illumination from which he benefited and his country benefited. Oh, isn't that nice? His slave mistress taught him how to read. Shouldn't we be all so grateful that he was enslaved and therefore, this is gaslighting. And Kamala Harris went down to Florida last week and called it out. She said this is misleading. She said they insult us in an attempt to gaslight us, and we will not stand for it. This was at the social action luncheon of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority down in Florida, which I believe is a black sorority. State Senator Geraldine Thompson said in a statement to the Daily Beast, she said, this focus is totally missing from the newly adopted, she said, Florida statute requires that instruction be provided on African civilization before colonization and slavery. This focus is totally missing from the newly adopted standards. The standards should not advance the misconception that our history as a people began with slavery and not with one of the most advanced civilizations in the world. End of quote. Now, she's a member of the task force, but she had nothing to do with, the history task force. It had nothing to do with the new standards because, again, that was the working group. She said this whitewashes the brutality that occurred when families were separated by being sold off during slavery and the resulting long-term trauma still experienced by current generations. In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
So that was supposed to be part of the curriculum. And no, Florida has pretty much stripped that out now. 3 members of this task force are pointing out now and complaining that what Ron DeSantis did is he actually created a quote, work group that was stacked with DeSantis's, people and bigots friendly to DeSantis. And they rewrote the curriculum without ever informing the African American History Task Force, and then put it into law without asking their opinions or anything. Dr. Donna Austin, who is a member of the actual African American History Task Force in the state of Florida, said it's the same divide techniques that they used on the plantation. It's the same identical thing. They always use methods of dividing the African and African American people. That's what they do. Apparently, some of the members on DeSantis' hand-picked task force are also black. For example, this is a quote from Social Studies 2023 standards. Quote, examine the various duties and trades performed by slaves like agricultural work, painting, carpentry, tailoring, domestic service, blacksmithing, and transportation. Instruction includes how slaves develop skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. End of quote. This rather flipped out these people. Another was, famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass was inspired by his mistress to read while enslaved. That small glimmer of light was enough to inspire him to turn it into a burning flame of illumination from which he benefited and his country benefited. Oh, isn't that nice? His slave mistress taught him how to read. Shouldn't we be all so grateful that he was enslaved and therefore, this is gaslighting. And Kamala Harris went down to Florida last week and called it out. She said this is misleading. She said they insult us in an attempt to gaslight us, and we will not stand for it. This was at the social action luncheon of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority down in Florida, which I believe is a black sorority. State Senator Geraldine Thompson said in a statement to the Daily Beast, she said, this focus is totally missing from the newly adopted, she said, Florida statute requires that instruction be provided on African civilization before colonization and slavery. This focus is totally missing from the newly adopted standards. The standards should not advance the misconception that our history as a people began with slavery and not with one of the most advanced civilizations in the world. End of quote. Now, she's a member of the task force, but she had nothing to do with, the history task force. But it had nothing to do with the new standards, because, again, that was the working group. She said this whitewashes the brutality that occurred when families were separated by being sold off during slavery, and the result...
We say fight back!
For the Thom Hartmann Book Club today, it's Waking the Witch, Reflections on Women, Magic, and Power by Pam Grossman. This is from the introduction. Witches have always walked among us, populating societies and storyscapes across the globe for thousands of years. From Circe to Hermione, from Morgan Le Fay to Marie Laveau, the witch has long existed in the tales we tell about ladies with strange powers who can harm or heal. And although people of all genders have been considered witches, it's a word that is now usually associated with women. Throughout most of history, she has someone to fear, an uncanny other who threatens our safety or manipulates reality for her own mercurial purposes. She's a pariah, a persona non grata, a boogie woman to defeat and discard. Although she's often been deemed a destructive entity, in actuality, a witchy woman has historically been far more susceptible to attack than an inflictor of violence herself. As with other terrifying outsiders, she occupies a paradoxical role in cultural consciousness as both vicious aggressor and vulnerable prey. Over the past 150 years or so, however, the witch has done another magic trick by turning from a fright into a figure of inspiration. She is now as likely to be the heroine of your favorite TV show as she is its villain. She might show up in the form of your Wiccan co-worker or the beloved musician who gives off a sorcerous vibe in videos or on stage. There's also a chance that she is you, and that witch is an identity you've taken upon yourself for any number of reasons, heartfelt or flippant, public or private. Today, more women than ever are choosing the way of the witch, whether literally or symbolically. They're floating down catwalks and sidewalks in gauzy black clothing and adorning themselves with Pinterest-worthy pentagrams and crystals. They're filling up movie theaters to watch witchy films and gathering in back rooms and backyards to do rituals, consult tarot cards, and set life-altering intentions. They're marching in the streets with Hex the Patriarchy placards and casting spells each month to try to constrain the commander-in-chief. Year after year, articles keep proclaiming it's the season of the witch, as journalists try to wrap their heads around the mushrooming witch trend. And all of this begs the question, why? Why do witches matter? Why are they seemingly everywhere right now? What exactly are they? And why the hell won't they go away? I get asked such things over and over, and you would think that after a lifetime of studying and writing about witches, as well as hosting a witch-themed podcast and being a practitioner of witchcraft myself, my answers would be succinct. In fact, I find that the more I work with the witch, the more complex she becomes. Hers is a slippery spirit. Try to pin her down and she'll only recede further into the dark, deep wood. I do know this for sure, though. Show me your witches, and I'll show you your feelings about women. The fact that the resurgence of feminism and the popularity of the witch are ascending at the same time is no coincidence. The two are reflections of each other. That said, this current witch wave is nothing new. I was a teen in the 1990s, the decade that brought us such pop culture as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Charmed, and The Craft. Not to mention Riot Girls and third-wave feminists who taught me that female power could come in a variety of colors and sexualities. I learned that women could lead a revolution while wearing lipstick and combat boots, and sometimes even a cloak. But my own witchly awakening came at an even earlier age. Morganville, New Jersey, where I was raised, was a solidly suburban town, but it retained enough natural land features back then to still feel a little bit scruffy in spots. We had a small patch of woods in our backyard that abutted a horse farm, and the two were separated by a wisp of running water that we could cross via a plank of wood. When we were little, my older sister Emily and I would sometimes venture to the other side where we could feed the horses, an act that still scares me to this day, and pick fistfuls of clover. But the majority of our time was spent on our side of the stream, threading ourselves through the thicket of trees that served as our personal forest. In one corner of the yard, a giant puddle would form whenever it rained, surrounded by a border of ferns. We called this spot our magical place. That it would vanish and then reappear only added to its mystery. It was a portal to the unknown. These woods are where I first remember doing magic, entering that state of deep play where imaginative action becomes reality. I would spend hours out there creating rituals with rocks and sticks, drawing secret symbols in the dirt, losing all track of time. It was a space that felt holy and wild, yet still strangely safe. As we age, we're supposed to stop filling our heads with such nonsense. Unicorns are to be traded in for Barbie dolls, though both are mythical creatures to be sure. We lose our tooth fairies, walk away from our wizards. Dragons get slain on the altar of our youth. Most kids grow out of their magic phase. I grew further into mine. My grandma Trudy was a librarian at the West Long Branch Library, which meant I got to spend many a long afternoon lurking between the 001.9 and 135 Dewey Decimal sections, reading about
program.
As Franklin D. Roosevelt would say at the beginning of a month, rabbits, rabbits, rabbits. It's the first day of August. It's named after Augustus, I believe, the Roman emperor, this month. We've got a lot to talk about. Of course, it's indictment watch, excuse me, for Donald Trump. The grand jury is meeting in Washington, D.C., the one that will presumably hand down an indictment for his attempt to overthrow the government of the United States and defraud the American people. There's also, I believe, there are indications that the grand jury that Fani Willis has down in Georgia are meeting at least this week. Whether it was yesterday or today or when it's going to be, we're not sure. So I'll keep you up to date on that. I mean, there's a possibility an indictment could come down today, and if so, I will certainly let you know. My guess, frankly, given previous indictments, correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that the previous indictments were handed down toward the end of the day, that they became breaking news around 4 or 5 o'clock Eastern time. So if that's the case, if they do come down, it may well come down after we get off the air. But I'll keep you up to date. We've got a TV monitor here in the studio, and of course we monitor all the news sites throughout the show. A lot to talk about today. Why American fascists label all those who oppose them as communists. And no, I'm not doing the same thing. I'll tell you about that. Also, what do Trump, Putin, Orban, and other authoritarians understand about your brain? And are teenage boys trending conservative? We'll talk about those things in the first hour of the program. In the second hour of the program, I want to get into the first publicly funded religious school in Oklahoma and whether or not it will make it through the courts and the bizarre things that the Republicans in Oklahoma are saying about this. Also, the real shocking story of how the Nazi symbol made it into a DeSantis ad. This is mind-boggling. It also may give us a clue as to why DeSantis is collapsing in the polls. And also in the second hour of our program, is Donald Trump's legal defense fund really a witness tampering scheme? It's looking more and more like it every day, and it's also, he's set up a new way that billionaires can throw money into it without ever being revealed to the public. I'll tell you all about that in the second hour of the program. In the third hour of the program, Maine's utilities are owned by two companies, one out of Calgary and one out of Spain, Canada and Spain, and they're trying to develop a state-owned utility, electric utility. Well, these two foreign-owned utilities are pouring millions of dollars into lobbying in the state. This, by the way, was illegal before Citizens United. We'll talk about that in the third hour of the program. Also, a new study confirms what trans kids have known for years, is that for years before they come out, they knew that they were trans, just generally speaking, like gays and lesbians. It blows apart this theory, this social contagion theory that Republicans are so fond of and are using as the basis for almost all of their anti-trans laws. Some amazing research on this, and I will give you all the details in hour 3 of the program. And finally, a crazy alert. Hannity flat out asks James Comer, will you be able to prove that Biden took a bribe? And Comer says, I sure hope so. Right, that's real definitive. Amazing stuff. But my op-ed today over at HartmannReport.com is titled, Why American Fascists Label All Those Who Oppose Them as Communists. I start out by talking about Robert Oppenheimer. I mean, so many of us have seen the movie now, and of course, even people who haven't seen the movie know the story. And in June of 1954, he lost his security clearance because his ex-wife was a member of the Communist Party, and he described himself to the inquisitors as a, quote, New Deal Democrat, which to them meant communist. And communism had a bad name back in the 1950s. In fact, it still has a bad name, and for good reason. Louise and I lived in West Germany for a year, a little over a year, back in 86, 87. And part of that year, we lived literally right on the East-West German border. The house that we were in was next to the road that ran along the side of the fence, the wall, between East and West Germany. And in fact, in the spring, sometimes the thawing soil from the sun in the morning in the spring would cause the landmines to explode and wake us up, in the morning. We visited Russia while it was, controlled, when it was the Soviet Union. We visited we traveled through Belarus. We didn't stop. They wouldn't let us stop, in fact. We visited East Berlin. And I can tell you, communism sucked. It just, you know, it was an authoritarian, it was a terrible situation, you know, for the people who lived there. So, you know, for good reason, accusing somebody of being a communist is a slur in America. But we don't have any communists in America. I mean, please, name one person who was elected to public office, or at least at the federal level. I mean, it might have happened locally someplace. But name one person who was elected to the House of Representatives or the United States Senate or, you know, to the White House who proudly wore the label communist. I don't know of any in my lifetime. I mean, there might have been some back in the 1920s, but, none today. But the Republicans are constantly using this now, this slur. And there's a reason for this. I'll get to that in a minute also that has to do with brain architecture. But, you know, a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump, when he was speaking in Erie, Pennsylvania, or no, he was campaigning in Iowa, he said, we're going to deny entry to all communists and Marxists. Now, the real problem is what do we do about the ones we already have that happen to be politicians? Nancy Pelosi, Schumer, Shifty Schiff. Right, communists. Ted Cruz told Fox News viewers, and I quote, Joe Biden has handed the agenda over to the socialists, and not just the socialists, this is now the Marxists, this is now the communists. Today's Democratic Party believes in violence. They believe in mob rule. They believe in intimidation, just like Marxists and communists. They're willing to burn our institutions to the ground to get what they want. Right. And then Ron DeSantis. Yeah, our campuses are hotbeds of communism. He says, you see at a college campus, students flying the hammer and sickle flag from the old Soviet Union, he told a group of cheering Republicans. Marjorie Taylor Greene, she says, they've been running this plan for decades now because the same people running this country, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, oh, let's not forget Hillary and Bill Clinton because they're not out of the picture, Barack Obama, all these people swore themselves to the communist agenda back when they were in college. No, they didn't. But they love to rant about communism because, you know, it's a bad word in America. Now, this anti-communist rhetoric that the Republican Party has been embracing really began in the 1950s. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board that racial segregation of classrooms was illegal. In 1958, the John Birch Society was created with big bucks from Fred Koch, the oil billionaire. And, you know, they started this campaign to impeach Earl Warren, which was basically, you know, we want segregated schools again. By this time, by the 1950s, we were 20 years into the New Deal. Now, the New Deal was a fundamental transformation of America. Unemployment insurance, minimum wage, the right to unionize, Social Security. These are all programs that could arguably be called socialist, or at least democratic socialist or social democracy. That's what they call them in Europe. They're not communism. This is a completely different thing. Yes, I realize Karl Marx used the word socialism to describe communism, but this is not communism. But yes, America did become kind of socialist in that regard. Food stamps, you know, we got even more with the Great Society. Lyndon Johnson brought us Medicare and Medicaid, and you know, we have free public schools nationwide, government-run water, septic, and electric utilities, free public roads and highways, you know, publicly funded police and fire. But we don't have communism. Communism is not going to come to America. Ending all private property, it's just not going to happen, period. But fascism might come to America. And there are people pushing it really, really hard. This movement by the morbidly rich who have fully captured the Republican Party is led by fossil fuel and big business oligarchs. And they're using the social and political and religious values of the old Confederacy to promote what is at its core fascism. They don't really believe that Democrats are communists. It's just a good slur. And then they use lies to promote their policy. The lie of voter fraud, for example, make it harder for people to vote in blue cities and red states. The lie that there's no such thing as climate change, it's paralyzed action here in the United States. The lie that Democrats drink children's blood. 30 million Americans seem to believe this lie now. And, you know, historically, fascists use so-called traditional values, hierarchy, patriarchy, to disempower and demonize women, queer people, minority ethnic and religious groups, gypsies, Jews, Muslims, and those who advocate for the interests of the working class and the poor. And, you know, this is nothing new. This is the old fascist thing. The other thing that they do is they try to lock down dissent. And now they are really on a roar on this thing. According to the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, 269 bills have been introduced in 45 states criminalizing dissent. 42 have been enacted. They include huge fees for permits to protest anywhere in Alabama and jail if you protest without a permit. A year in jail in Arkansas for making a sidewalk impassable during a protest. Up to 6 years in Arkansas prison for trespassing in the vicinity of a pipeline. Conspiracy charges, including up to a year in prison in Arkansas for planning a protest where people, even if they're not associated with the protest, cause property damage. Florida criminalizing and associating huge fines with, quote, unpermitted temporary activity or any event organized or promoted by a social media platform. Redefining riot in Florida as, quote, endangering the safe movement of a vehicle. In other words, blocking traffic is now felony riot, and it has a 15-year prison sentence associated with it. It also allows a person like Kyle Rittenhouse, who kills a rioter, to get off scot-free if the murder victim was, quote, acting in furtherance of a riot. In other words, there. And it goes on. I mean, I could go through the whole list here. I'm going to run out of time, but, you know, in my article, I list, I think, probably 15 or 20 of these different states that have basically made protest. The First Amendment says we have the right to petition our government for redress of grievance. Not anymore. Not in red states. By the way, these are all red states that are doing this. So, you know, are they going to succeed? Well, you know, they're trying to do what Hungary did. And I'm very concerned about this. Are you?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I mean, I'm optimistic. I think people are waking up to their shtick, but they're building this stuff into law. And welcome back. And let's see here. Let's see. Bjorn in Los Angeles. Hey, Bjorn, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, how you doing this morning?
Good. What's up?
Well, I'm out here on the strike line with SAG-AFTRA. We're walking with the Writers Guild.
Hey, good
on you. Report to you. Thank you so much. We're really high-spirited here today. We've got a big group from the Family Guy who's with us. I happen to be in front of Fox today. But this fits in so much with what you talk about, Tom, and how important unionism is in our country and how it grew so much earlier and how it's been weakened since Reagan tearing apart our air traffic controllers. And it's so encouraging to see unionism strengthening itself again and people realizing what a grip that the entire anti-union movement has been.
Yeah.
What a grip this Republican movement has been for us, and how negatively it's affecting young people, how negatively it's affecting old people, how much it's impacting those of the working classes. And so our strike is important because it's not just about the Screen Actors Guild and the American Federation of Radio Television Artists, our unified union. It's not just about the writers, but this is about paying working people for their work.
Well, and not only that, it's also about preventing actors from being cloned and used without compensation by studios using AI.
Absolutely.
Which I guess is a form of what you just said, you know, not being paid for your work.
Well, that's right, Tom. That's right, Tom. And we're even trying to, we are striking also for them to live up to the agreements that they've made in the past that they're not even doing. You know, when you're an actor and you're out on location, you need to get your per diem in cash because you may or may not have an available bank and you need to eat that day. And they're tending to pay our per diems later or including in a check where you're getting taxes taken out of it. And that doesn't help you get breakfast that morning. So there's lots and lots and lots of things like this, Tom. But it's, you know, it's important what's happening, and it's also important. I listen to you every morning because I believe that information is power. And I love how you're straight talk to people. And I especially love when people who are of differing opinions call in, and how you cogently and calmly talk to them with information, because with our news have been turned into entertainment, we've forgotten, you know, when you and I were young, propaganda was a bad word. I don't even hear the word used anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. It's most of what is coming. It's certainly what is coming out of the right-wing machine. I mean, you know, it's which is pretty breathtaking. So you're on the picket line, Bjorn, in Los Angeles. You said with the Writers Guild, not with the SAG-AFTRA, or are they joining forces?
I'm a SAG-AFTRA member. I'm a SAG-AFTRA member. I'm carrying my SAG-AFTRA sign, and we're about 50-50 between the writers, the WGEA members here, and the SAG-AFTRA members. And
is are people feeling grim, or are people feeling enthusiastic, or both?
I would say very enthusiastic. The spirits here are very high. It's always great when the members of the two unions are able to actually be with one another. And when you're walking for several hours, you end up having conversations with people you've never met and sharing your experience and your points of view. And that's been terrific.
That's a great thing. Okay, Bjorn, thank you so much for the call. It's great to hear from you.
Thank you so much for taking me, Tom. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. We'll be right back. It is 22 minutes past the hour. Stay tuned. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capital Switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. Back in 2010, when Viktor Orban took over the Fidesz party in Hungary, that party was sort of like the Republican Party. It was just a conventional conservative European political party. And he has turned it into a neo-fascist powerhouse. He pushed through he altered the nation's constitution to push through what we would call gerrymandering and voter suppression so that his party will always win. He campaigned on building a wall. Build a wall was literally one of his campaign slogans, and he did build a wall across the southern border of Hungary to keep out Syrian refugees who were fleeing the violence when Russia was bombing that country. His other two campaign slogans were, and I quote, "Restore Christian purity and make Hungary great again." Seriously, back in 2010, 6 years before Trump. There's an amazing backstory about how Viktor Orban is being cloned, essentially, in the GOP. You can find the article over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. And welcome back. What Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Viktor Orban understand about your brain. Marcel Vanessa writing over at Politico. He's a neuroscience, and he says, my research analyzes real speeches made by real politicians, past and present, including those of Trump, Orban, and Putin, using cognitive linguistics, a branch of linguistics that examines the relationship between language and the mind. He says, what I have found is that throughout history, speeches by dictators and autocrats have one thing in common. They use dehumanizing metaphors to instill and propagate hatred of others. Now, let me just ask you to think about this for a moment. What he's saying and what this research finds is that when politicians use words like vermin or invasion or infestation or pests or pestilence or trash to describe human beings, it actually alters the way the brain works. And this alteration, if people are exposed to it long enough and frequently enough, can actually rewire the way that people's brains work and cause them to completely lose empathy for others, the other in this case, the people who are being referred to as vermin, or rats or whatever. And once they've lost empathy for them, then it's just a short ride to the Rwandan slaughter or the Nazi death camps. I mean, it's not that, or just, easy, imprisonment of them. This is, I would argue that, white people used slurs against black people for most of our history, and And that's why most white people are, or at least seem to be, relatively unconcerned about the fact that, you know, black people are 2 to 1 represented in our prisons compared to white people, inappropriately. 3 to 1, they get stopped for minor offenses in the state of Florida, for example. 3 to 1, black people to white people for jaywalking, even though black people are only, I think it's 17% of the population of Florida. I have to go back and look, but it's a small percentage, relatively small. So the question that I would ask you is, can you remember a time when any Democrat used this kind of language? Have you ever heard President Biden refer to another group of people as rats or vermin or, you know, terrible or, you know, invasions? I can't. I can't think of any Democrat using this kind of language. Republicans routinely use this kind of language. It is dehumanizing, and it leads to horrible consequences. It's just an absolutely fascinating study. I recommend you check it out. It's over on Politico.com. Stay tuned.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
High school boys are trending conservative. Uh-oh. I'll tell you about that after the break, and then I'll pick up your calls. Stay with us. Today's book in our book club is The Hidden History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back, by this guy, Thom Hartmann. This is from chapter 1, or from the introduction, actually. In 2016, 6% of Americans who were eligible to vote nominated Donald Trump as the GOP's presidential candidate. It was 8% for Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. Trump went on to be elected president by 26% of eligible voters. The modern American oligarchs have largely stayed in power using 3 simple elements: explicit and overt racism, massive disinformation campaigns, and voter suppression. No ideas, no push for better schools, hospitals, airports, roads, or bridges, or reform of our health, energy, or financial systems. No promise of more and better jobs. None of these staples of past presidential campaigns can be found in pretty much any Republican advertising today. Instead, the public Republican message is all about race, or the subset of race, religion. Muslim stands in for brown Arab in GOP speak, and immigration, a.k.a. brown people from south of our border, and socialism. Meanwhile, Republican secretaries of state across the nation are vigorously purging voters from the rolls. Over 17 million, more than 10% of America's active voters, in just the 2016-2018 period, according to NBC News. After the, after the 5 Republican appointees on the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, 14 GOP-controlled states moved within a year, some within days, to restrict access to the vote, particularly for communities of color, students, and retired people. In North Carolina, for example, 158 polling places were permanently closed in the 40 counties with the most African-American voters just before the 2016 election, leading to a 16% decline in African-American early voting in that state. An MIT study found that nationwide, Hispanic voters wait 150% longer in line than white voters, and black voters can expect to wait 200% longer in line to vote. In Indiana, then Governor Mike Pence's new rigorous voter ID law caused an 11.5% drop in African-American voting. Students are suing for their right to vote, and retired people who no longer drive but care passionately about their Social Security and Medicare are being turned away at the polls by the hundreds of thousands because their driver's licenses have expired. The obvious failure of 40-plus years of Reaganomics and GOP policies to maintain a functional middle class in America has been a problem for the modern GOP. In 1974, for example, the GOP had outright control of only 7 states. The message, elect us and we'll help the rich people, just didn't generally resonate with American voters. It's the reason why, outside of the fluke elections of 46 and 52, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives outright for 3 generations, from 1933 to 1996, and controlled the Senate for most of that time. Desperate to win the presidency for the GOP in 1968, Richard Nixon went so far as to commit treason by torpedoing a peace deal with President Lyndon Johnson that President Lyndon Johnson had worked out with the North and South Vietnamese. According to Abul Hassan Bonnie Sadr, then president of Iran, Ronald Reagan did the same thing by cutting a deal with Iran whereby they would hold on to the U.S. embassy hostages until after the 1980 presidential election, torpedoing Jimmy Carter's chances of re-election. But in 2000, the GOP changed tactics. After Reagan was almost busted for his part in Iran-Contra, he testified that he had forgotten about details of the program more than 80 times. His growing Alzheimer's spared him an indictment. They realized that getting busted for treason wasn't worth the risk. They needed a plan B, and it was deliciously simple. If most voters don't like what you're selling, then just don't let them vote. Paul Weyrich promoted this idea back in 1980 when he was campaigning for Reagan after co-founding the Heritage Foundation. And indeed, many Republican luminaries, such as William Rehnquist, who went from serving the GOP by standing in polling places and intimidating Hispanic and Native American voters in the 1960s, to becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, rose up through the ranks by participating in Republican-run voter intimidation schemes. Voter suppression became the foundational go-to tactic for the GOP in 2000. Although the GOP attacked Democratic presidential nominee Al Gore with smear and innuendo, ridiculing him for helping write the legislation that created the modern internet, for example, the main thing that got George W. Bush into the White House was voter suppression. His brother, Florida Governor Jeb Bush, and Bush's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, threw somewhere between 20,000 and 90,000 African-American voters off the rolls. They were able to get the vote close enough. The 5 Republican appointees to the Supreme Court functionally awarded Bush the presidency. The BBC covered this in 2001 in 2 major investigative reports that were seen all over the world, except on any American media. By 2016, the Republican Party had fine-tuned its voter suppression and intimidation systems to the point that they ran like well-oiled machines in nearly 30 states. Between the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections, for example, Ohio had purged more than 2 million voters from its rolls, the vast majority, more than 2 to 1, in heavily African-American and Hispanic counties. The 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that they could keep it up. And other states have since adopted their new tactic of caging voters. The book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, by me.
Did you know that every weekday we send out an email before the show giving you all the topics coming up so you can be fully informed and ready to interact with our program? Or that after the show we send out Sue's Stack, a list of every topic I've discussed along with clickable hot links to every source of information I've shared with you on the air? It's all completely free and available over at thom.tv, THOM.tv. Check it out. Well, here's an interesting bit of news. This is published over at The Hill today by Daniel DeVise. And 12th grade boys have become overwhelmingly conservative. Roughly 1/4 of high school seniors self-identified as conservative or very conservative on a Monitoring the Future survey, writes Daniel DeVise, a scholarly endeavor that dates to the 1970s. Only 13% of boys identified as liberal or very liberal. As recently as the late 2000s, he points out, liberal boys outnumbered conservatives. Back in the Carter era, both boys and girls leaned liberal. So, you know, what's happening with the boys? Well, it looks like the right-wingers have succeeded in conquering the gaming space, and they're using gaming spaces and social media, to recruit right-wing, to recruit teenage boys to right-wing causes, and particularly leaning heavily on misogyny, on, you know, the girls are out to get us, or the girls don't want to have sex with us, and therefore, you know, we need to reinforce the patriarchy, that kind of stuff, basically. I mean, you know, they don't say it that way, obviously, but on the other hand, young women are trending liberal. Women 18 to 29 are far more likely to identify as liberal than in the past 2 decades. Might have something to do with the Supreme Court and abortion. Right now, 12th grade girls who identified as liberal rose from 19% in 2012 to 30% in 2022. Only 12% of high school seniors, girls, identify as conservative. 10 years ago, young adults split evenly between the two political camps. This is fascinating. He notes the conservative wing of the Republican Party has made pointed appeals to disaffected men of all ages. The progressive agenda seeks equality in gender and race, a platform that has cost them support among boys, especially white boys. Traditional notions of masculinity are much more accepted. This is what one of the scientists said within conservatism, while feminist values are clearly one of the driving forces of liberalism. This is Delano Squares, who's a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And defenders of the patriarchy reach young men where they live on social media and in gaming circles. Interesting times we live in, eh? All right, what's on your mind? Those are my stories for the day. Alfredo, or at least for the hour. Alfredo in Mountain View, California. Hey, Alfredo, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, thank you for taking my call. We should call Republicans oligarch socialists. That's what they are. I'm calling about, about a way to get rid of Trump. The DNC, and I mentioned this before, the DNC should sue Trump for defamation for $1 billion. There's testimony already out there of witnesses saying that Trump knew he lost the election. He admitted also himself that he lost the election, and he continues to lie and propagate this lie about the election being stolen from him. This is an open and shut case. Mm-hmm. And not only do you will succeed in a lawsuit like this, but you will silence all these Republican followers who continue to perpetuate this lie as well. So anyway, that is just my 2 cents of the issue.
I think it's a great idea, Alfredo. I mean, if Dominion voting systems can do it against Fox, why can't the Democratic Party do it against Trump or do it against the GOP for that matter? The GOP has not officially repudiated this. In fact, Republicans in state after state are passing laws making it harder and harder for people in blue cities to vote. Cutting back on the number of polling places, cutting back on the number of days and hours where you could vote in these cities, eliminating drop boxes, making it almost impossible to vote by mail, which really impacts people who have to take time off from work who are paid by the hour rather than salaries. They've got a whole list. Plus, they're purging people like there's no tomorrow in the cities, in the blue cities and red states. So I think a lawsuit would work. It seems, I was going to say, I don't know that the proof is there. All those 60 court cases that Trump has lost, including one before the Supreme Court, that's consequential.
Yeah. He just lost another case. He was suing CNN for $75 million or so. Right. And a Trump-appointed judge laughed him out of court. He told him, leave my court.
He didn't just laugh him out of court. He said that Trump is running a grift. He's raising money off the lie that he actually won the election. You're absolutely right, Alfredo. It would be interesting, and the discovery in that kind of a lawsuit would be fascinating. So, I guess the question is, does Jamie Harrison have the guts to take this on?
And what a loser. This guy cannot win a case in court.
Trump,
and this is the guy that GOP is supporting.
Well, it's looking increasingly thank you, Alfredo. It's looking increasingly like he's going to be the Republican nominee. So now the question is, can he win an election? I don't think so. But, I'm not counting out anything. I didn't think so in 2016 either. Alfredo, thank you for the call. Annie in Sugar Grove, North Carolina. Hey, Annie, what's on your mind today?
Well, you were talking about the protests and how many, red states are passing laws. I remember watching Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearings, and Ben Sass asked her to name off my freedoms. And I'm not kidding. She had her little Pebble Flintstone voice and counted on her fingers. Assembly, speech, press, religion. What am I missing here? Then she said it, press, religion, assembly, speech, counting on her fingers, and also said the second time, what am I missing here? And Ben Sass had to tell her our right to protest. She sits on the Supreme Court.
Oh, God.
My late father was a civics teacher. He's been spinning in his urn since Trump slithered down the escalator.
I can imagine.
And I've been following politics since probably around a little before Hurricane Katrina, and been making calls since back then for like, 2023? So like 20. A little bit before that. So anyway, yeah, she couldn't name our 5 freedoms. And the one that she missed was our right to protest. Now, look at the states that are passing laws that we're not allowed to protest. I mean, we can protest, but we'll be,
in jail,
arrested, and
yes, or hit with huge fines.
Yeah, or fines or whatever. So I've called several congresspeople and senators when that all happened, and even Ben Sass's office, and said, "Wow, she can't name our 5 freedoms. Wow," and she sits on the Supreme Court. So. That's my 2 cents worth today.
Okay, that was a good one, Annie. Thank you very much.
Scary, too.
Yeah, indeed. I
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it. Thank you. Joan in Rochester, Minnesota. Hey, Joan, what's on your mind today?
Well, Tom, I was thinking about the voters and the people that work diligently at the polls every election time and work with the everyday people, and then to have the Republicans accuse them of fixing or removing votes, when actually I would imagine both Republicans and Democrats work at those polls.
Yes.
They don't have time to do all that. And I think when they picked on that lady and her daughter, that was a really awful thing to do, because those people deserve a lot of credit for the work they do.
Yeah, Shea Moss and Ruby Freeman. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that the Republicans have overlooked the fact that they've got people on there. If they felt so picked on, why didn't they have their people do the same thing?
Well, they universally go after people who volunteer to work on elections in blue cities, largely in red states. It's go after them in Atlanta, go after them in Milwaukee. Minnesota's not a red state, but they have. Go after them in Detroit when the Republicans controlled Michigan. Go ahead.
Well, if both sides did the same thing, all the votes would end up in the trash, and we wouldn't have a result for an election, because the Republicans would throw out the Democrat votes, and Democrats would throw out the Republican votes, and we wouldn't have any ballots at all. So I think they need to quit picking on the little guy.
Yeah, this is one of the most destructive memes for democracy that the Republican Party has come up with. And they've been promoting it, by the way, since the 60s. I mean, this was William Rehnquist helped start Operation Eagle Eye, which was a way of trying to intimidate Hispanic and Native American voters in Arizona. And it went nationwide. In the 1980s, they were doing caging, where they sent postcards to people, and if you don't return them, you get removed from the voting rolls. They had for over 30 years, they were operating under a court injunction not to do caging, but they did it anyway. And then finally, in 2018, the Supreme Court legalized caging in the case when John Husted, the Secretary of State of Ohio, was sued by voting rights advocates in Ohio because he was purging hundreds of thousands of people from the voting rolls in the blue cities in Ohio, but not in the rural areas, and or not so much in the rural areas. And this is just wrong stuff. I mean, this should not happen. And you're right; it's a threat to our democracy. The whole thing is a threat to our democracy. Joan, thank you so much for the call. It is 45 minutes past the hour. Taking back the mainstream media 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, right here. I'm Thom Hartmann. I'll be right back with more of your calls.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Fair and only slightly unbalanced. Right back with your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Brian in Pompano Beach, Florida. Hey, Brian, thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. It says you disagree with me about what?
Yeah, Tom, you had mentioned that Republicans are the only ones that say disparaging comments.
Well, specifically that they're using words that associate human beings with animals. Yeah, filth, vermin, invasion, rats. I don't recall Democrats using that kind of language. Do you? Do you have an example?
Well, yeah. I'm looking here at Hillary Clinton said that half of Donald Trump's supporters belong in a basket of deplorables.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And she apologized for that, by the way, a week later.
I'm sorry?
She apologized for that a week later. And that's the, I think that's probably the only example you can come up with.
Well, I can go back and look at some of the things that Obama has said about his opponents. I mean,
I guarantee you, he has not called them filth. He hasn't called them rats. He hasn't called them animals. He hasn't said that they represent an invasion. He doesn't use, Democrats don't use dehumanizing language. It's so much a part of the Democratic DNA that the other day I posted a piece over on Daily Kos, and I referred to MAGA people as maggots, M-A-G-A-T, and they took it down. They didn't take it down. They sent me a note saying, we're going to take this down if you don't take the T off the end, because that implies, now I meant MAGA Trump. I was referring specifically to Trump people, but what the hell? I also get that it's me doing what I'm condemning here. And they said, if you're going to refer to people as insects, we're not going to allow you to post here. And then they were right, and I was wrong.
Mm-hmm. That's good, Tom. That's good. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Good talking with you. Mike in Henderson, North Carolina. Hey, Mike, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching Free Speech.
Hey, Tom. I actually just took one of my points away.
What's that?
I've actually used the term maggots before too, and you're right. It's not a good thing to do. I do note that Democrats in general have. I think of them as having a better sense of honor, a higher sense of honor than most Republicans. But my point, actually, that I was going to call about was that, and you did this too. By the way, you told the guy you owned up to that. And hang on a minute. Oh, yeah, you asked him why he thought what he thought and what was his evidence. And in general, I don't think we do this enough to Republicans, to the right wing.
Yeah.
They say things and they avert things. And, nobody says, what do you mean? Where did you get that?
Right.
Donald Trump was an excellent example when he averred, I can't remember exactly what it was, but he averred that there was something hinky with the election. Nobody asked him, where did you get this? And when he took the papers from Mar-a-Lago, and he said, I have an absolute right to do that. Mm-hmm. And nobody ever said to him, who told you that? Yeah,
well, he claims that the Presidential Records Act gives him that right, which is the exact opposite of what the Presidential Records Act says. But, the truth has never inhibited Donald Trump. He has no problem just lying through his teeth, Mike. Mike, I got to run, but thanks for the call. Excellent points all. It's 49 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio, and tag you're it. That's before the hour. Welcome back. Susan, and is it Ontonagon, Michigan? It's a town I've never been to. Am I saying it right?
You are saying it right. Almost. It's Ontonagon.
Ontonagon. I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yes, we're in the Porcupine Mountains. And thank you, Tom, for all that you do. I just wanted to say that I agree what you said regarding Republicans and Democrats. We are in a heavily Trump area here, and the signs are embarrassing, the language that the Republicans are using.
For example?
I just look at them and say, their language alone says so much about them. What I wanted to add to that is I'm not a theologian. I am seminary trained. And I've sort of decided on my own that my definition of sin is disconnect. And if we can disconnect from someone just by using words, names, we can hurt them because then they're not like us. And I'm sorry to say, but I believe our military does it better than anyone. Once they have dehumanized the other by calling them anything from Krauts to who knows what.
Yeah. My dad, my dad joined during World War II, and he referred to Japs and Krauts his whole life. I mean, that was just burned into him in basic training, I guess.
Exactly. And again, that's the military. Our churches, our religions do that. If they're not who we are, if they don't believe the same as we do, they become the other.
Right.
And if they're different thinking, different theology, different whatever than us, it's okay to hurt them. And these are the people, our military, our churches, and other groups that believe they are working towards peace. That's not peace. It's harmful, and we are letting other people's actions define who we are.
Yeah. Excellent points all, Susan. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Tim in Jackson, Wyoming. Hey, Tim, what's on your mind today?
Actually, I just was going to expand on Susan's call. First of all, Porcupine Mountains are a beautiful area if you ever get a chance to get up there. But to her point, the military, our nation's police force started using those same military tactics when they became so militarized. They refer to people as subjects. They're not humans; they're subjects.
Yeah, or unsubs,
and so
unknown
it's
subjects.
A lot easier to put. It's a lot easier to put your knee on a subject's neck than it is on a human's neck.
Right.
And so, yeah, and they did. They took that from the military. That's something, when our national police force started becoming militarized after 9/11. That was part of their training. That was part of they dehumanize the people. The people are your enemy. They are not people you are there to protect and serve. They are there to get you. They are your enemy.
Right.
You call them
we got a big dose of that after 9/11.
Easier to treat them poorly.
Yeah. I said we got a big dose of that after 9/11, and referring to Middle Eastern people as ragheads and all these slurs that were just fairly common in the year or two immediately after 9/11, which I think helped justify, and I suspect the Bush-Cheney administration was very happy about this, helped justify the 2 wars that they lied us into.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I personally, I've thought this for a long time. I think one of the biggest parts of police reform needs to be just the way they look at people in general.
Yeah.
Start looking at us as humans again.
And the language they use. I'm with you. Tim, excellent. Thank you very much for that. Nancy in Woodland, California. Hey, Nancy, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, I just wanted to get your comments on what I see as a hypocrisy of Republican politicians and voters who love Putin and Orban, and Tucker Carlson's on Russian TV all the time, and yet they will go after Democrats calling them communists.
Right.
I don't understand, and nobody calls them on that. I mean, it doesn't even make sense.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. As I said earlier, I don't know of a single communist who's ever been elected in my lifetime. At least at the federal level. There might be one on a city council someplace, but if so, I'm unaware of it. But America does not have a communism problem, but we do very much have a fascism problem, and we don't acknowledge it. We don't, in the way that we really need to. The Republican, you got some Republicans out there saying this. You've got the former head of the National Republican Party, Michael Steele, talking about how the Republican Party no longer believes in democracy. You've got former David Jolly. These are the Republicans that pop up on MSNBC all the time, so I'm most familiar with them. But there are Republicans who will acknowledge that the Republican Party has lost its way, has abandoned democracy. And some will even, point out that they're embracing fascism. But, the Republicans continue to use this anti-communist language as if it's real, and there literally is not a communism problem in America. Nancy, thank you. Thank you for that. Jan in Spokane, Washington. Hey, Jan, what's up? What's on your mind?
I wanted to talk about a couple of things right quick. One, Viktor Orban. I had a very good friend in Hungary, We are both jewelry makers, and that's where our main connection was. But I got to know her very well. She had a lovely son. He was a special needs child. She told me one time that her life was a life of duty because of her son. And she also told me that she could not live under an authoritarian regime again. That she had done that before and she couldn't do it again. And her son had to have surgery on his head. And I don't know what happened, but suddenly my friend over there disappeared. I've heard nothing from her. I can't get in touch with her. She won't respond. So I don't know what happened to my friend. But if something happened to her son in that surgery, then I don't think she stayed around for long. Because she was very upset.
Well, Orban has flipped Hungary into a neo-fascist state. I mean, it's a soft fascism, but he imprisons his enemies. I mean, just like fascists always do.
He does.
Jan, I got to run, but thank you for sharing that story. That's fascinating. It's the top of the hour. We'll be back with more of the news of the day, as they say. Actually, will the first publicly funded religious school make it beyond the courts? And is Trump's legal defense fund really a witness tampering scheme? And the shocking story of how a Nazi symbol showed up in a Ron DeSantis ad. It truly is shocking.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is the second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America by Carol Anderson. This is from the introduction. It was like a snuff film, that July 6th, 2016 live stream. Philando Castile sat in his car, buckled in, bleeding, dying. "Why did you shoot him, sir?" asked his fiancée, Diamond Reynolds, pain piercing her every word. Castile, who had been pulled over in a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, because his, quote, wide-set nose, end quote, supposedly resembled that of a robbery suspect, had been reaching for his ID, but in order to avoid any surprises, let the police officer know he had a gun with him, a legally permitted, right-to-carry concealed gun. That was all the cop needed to know. Officer Geronimo Yanez began shooting. Castile's death came just one day after Alton Sterling's down in Louisiana. He, too, was carrying a gun, which was not unusual in this right-to-carry state. Granted, Sterling had a felony conviction, so owning a firearm was, for him, illegal, but he had been robbed before and wanted protection. On July 5th, 2016, the Baton Rouge police received a 911 call that there was a man with a weapon threatening customers at a local convenience store. As officers rolled onto the scene, they saw Sterling sitting there, selling CDs and DVDs. just as the store owner allowed him to do and indeed welcomed. The threatening man was not Sterling. In fact, there was no threatening man. It had been a prank call, but that didn't matter. Within a few minutes, police had thrown the black man down, pinned him to the asphalt, and then started yelling that Sterling had a gun. He did. It was in his pocket where he could hardly reach it, what with the officers squatting on both his legs and one arm. Nevertheless, the police began firing round after round into his prone body, point blank. Blood poured out of his chest, but not for long. Alton Sterling was dead. The back-to-back deaths of these two black men police had shot for carrying guns should have jolted into action the Second Amendment's staunchest advocate, the National Rifle Association. In 1995, for example, the organization's denunciations flew fast and furious when it contended that law enforcement not only overreacted, but went out of its way to kill gun owners. Angered by the deaths at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, and the siege and firefight at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, both of which were sparked by federal agents serving warrants for weapons violations, Wayne LaPierre, the NRA's executive vice president, angrily wrote, quote, "If you have a badge, you have the government's go-ahead to harass, intimidate, and even murder law-abiding citizens," end quote. He further denounced cops as, quote, "jackbooted government thugs who have more power to take away our constitutional rights, break in our doors, seize our guns, destroy our property, and even injure or kill us." Nearly 2 decades later, that sentiment had not changed. This was evident when Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy, who had refused to pay over $1 million in fees for grazing his cattle on public land, summoned his gun-toting, self-styled militiamen to do battle with federal authorities to prevent the seizure of his herd for restitution. Richard Mack, a former recipient of the NRA's Law Enforcement Officer of the Year award, asserted, "If federal agents are going to start killing people, I'm sorry, but to show the world how ruthless these people are, women and children need to be placed in the front lines as human shields." Mack didn't flinch as he insisted, quote, "Women need to be the first ones shot. I would have put my own wife or daughter there on the front lines, and I would have been a screaming bloody murder to watch them die," end quote. Larry Pratt, a speaker at the NRA's 2014 National Convention, commenting on the fact that Bundy, quote, "backed them," the Bureau of Land Management agents, down with automatic rifles and other deadly weaponry, proudly called that armed confrontation, quote, "a proper, legitimate, lawful response to illegitimate, unlawful exercise of government power, particularly on the federal level," end quote. Yet how quickly the NRA's swagger disappeared when government agents gunned down Philando Castile and Alton Sterling for merely carrying guns. Sterling's death didn't even merit acknowledgement. As for Castile, the NRA broke its silence only after inordinate pressure from African-American members led the gun manufacturers' lobby to issue a tepid statement that the Second Amendment was applicable, quote, "regardless of race, religion, or sexual orientation." When pressed further by many of its members to stand up for Castile, the often fierce organization demurred, saying it was, quote, "important for the NRA not to comment while the investigation is ongoing." This situational silence did not go unnoticed. The NRA had not only loudly defended the rights of those at the Branch Davidian cult and at Ruby Ridge, men who had actually shot and killed members of law enforcement, but the organization had also doubled down on calling for more guns in the face of mass shootings in a public school in Newtown, Connecticut, and a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Yet here, the guardian of the Second Amendment was now deliberately ignoring the inconvenient fact that black men had been killed for merely possessing a firearm. "Where's the NRA?" asked journalist Hannah Kozlowska. "Didn't Sterling and Philando Castile have Second Amendment rights too?" David Graham in The Atlantic coolly observed that, quote, "two shootings give a strong sense that the Second Amendment does not apply to black Americans the same way it does to white Americans," end quote. Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson wrote that he saw the old Jim Crow whites only sign plastered above the Second Amendment. The book, The Second, by Carol Anderson.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to hour 2 of our program. The first publicly funded religious school in the United States. You know, the framers of the Constitution, the founders of this country were, generally speaking, quite clear that they did not want America to be a theocracy. There were exceptions. Patrick Henry was probably the biggest and most well-known exception. He was the largest slaveholder in the state of Virginia. He owned over 360 human beings and was one of the more brutal owners. He had a terribly brutal slave breakers and slave masters who worked for him. He also was not a fan of the Constitution. He argued against the Constitution to the point that at the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1789 that James Madison modified the Second Amendment to protect the slave patrol in Virginia at Patrick Henry's insistence. But all that said, and Patrick Henry was a fundamentalist Christian, a born-again believer, you know, whatever you want to call it. He was an evangelical's evangelical back in the day. And he used his religion to justify his ownership of human beings. But he was the exception, not the rule. I realize he's the exception that, you know, right-wingers and Republicans love to cite. They quote Patrick Henry a lot. But, you know, most of the founders were not all that down with religion. In fact, many of them were not even religious. Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, they were all deists. They didn't even call themselves Christians. Jefferson went through the first 4 books of the New Testament, the 4 Gospels, and cut out all of Jesus' miracles with a razor blade, reassembled it, and published it as the Jefferson Bible, presenting Jesus as a philosopher. And that's still in print today. You can buy it on Amazon right now or at your local bookstore. So they were very clear about this, and they wrote into the Constitution in several places, in the body of the Constitution itself, that there shall be no religious test for service as an employee or an elected official of the United States government. And in the First Amendment, that basically, you know, religion shall not interfere with government, and government shall not interfere with religion. You have the freedom of religion, but you also have the freedom from religion. James Madison referred to this as the wall of separation between church and state. Now, that doesn't appear in any of our documents. That was his personal reference. But that was what they all understood they were doing. So now comes the St. Isidore of Seville Catholic Virtual School in Oklahoma. And the Oklahoma School Board, the state superintendent of public education, his name is Ryan Walters, and he's a Republican who was elected to office last year. He says that he supports the creation of this new Catholic charter school. It will be funded entirely with money, or maybe largely, with money from the state of Oklahoma. So Oklahoma's taxpayers are being forced at the barrel of a gun to pay taxes to support a Catholic school. And he said, quote, "It's time to end atheism as the state-sponsored religion." Now, there's a difference between arguing that there is no God, which is what atheism is, and arguing that whatever the religion is you want to practice, government shouldn't interfere with it, and it shouldn't interfere with government. Those are literally 2 completely different things. Atheism and a separation of church and state. You couldn't get more different. But the state superintendent of public education in Oklahoma apparently doesn't understand that distinction. Now, either he's not a very bright man, which is entirely possible, he is a Republican, or he's lying through his teeth. He is a smart man, and he knows exactly what he's talking about, and he's simply lying to the people of Oklahoma to justify a religious school, which frankly I think is more likely. But in either case, this is a terrible thing. The state of Oklahoma is going to pay $25.7 million over the first 5 years to fund this Catholic school. Now, I have no problem with Catholic schools. You know, when I was a kid in Lansing, Michigan, I used to walk, when I was going to junior high school, I had to walk about 4 miles to get to school, uphill both ways. But seriously, it was about a 4-mile walk to school. And I did that, you know, every day, 7th, 8th, 9th grade. And halfway there was a huge Catholic school right there on Cedar Street in Lansing, and several of my friends went to that school. And, you know, they would be getting out about the same time that I was walking home from Walter French Junior High School. And we'd hang out together. And you know, Catholic school is just fine. If you're Catholic and you want to go to a Catholic school, God bless you. But don't ask me to pay for it. Don't ask my government to fund it. So the ACLU has come out and said, this is wrong. And they have sued, and they're asking a judge to block this. And the Catholics, the Catholic Church, Brett Farley, the executive director of the Catholic Conference of Oklahoma, says Catholic schools accept all comers, so the claim that St. Isidore will discriminate is entirely unfounded. So it seems to me like this is a straw man argument. Basically, the ACLU is saying government shouldn't be funding religious education. They're not saying that it's a form of discrimination. They're saying it's a violation of the separation of church and state. The Catholic Church is saying in response, but we let atheists come to our school. We don't discriminate. We let Jews come to our school. We let Muslims come to our school. We let Hindus come. Anybody can come to our school. Well, that's not the point. The point isn't whether you're discriminating. The point is that you're teaching religion with state money, which is not what the founders and framers intended or wanted, and frankly is not what any of us should intend or want. This is one step closer to a state religion. And when you have a state religion, you have a state religion is essentially, to a large extent, incompatible with democracy, unless you're going to have a state where basically the only people who have any power in that state are of that religion. So keep an eye on this. We'll see how this plays out, but you know, keep an eye on this. Meanwhile, Ron DeSantis alert. This is absolutely fascinating. You know, there have been these two bizarre videos. We've all seen them. In fact, I believe I played both of them on this program for people who are watching us on Free Speech TV or YouTube or on the web at freespeech.org or tom.tv. The first of those two bizarre videos was this weird homoerotic thing of Donald Trump saying that he supports LGBTQ people and he supports trans people and he thinks a trans woman should be eligible to serve in to participate in one of his beauty pageants. And he did say those things back in the day. And then it's interspliced with pictures of oiled up bodybuilding men, you know, with the muscles popping all over the place and guys carrying guns and shooting people and, you know, all this kind of testosterone-drenched macho imagery interspersed with rapid cuts of pictures of Ron DeSantis' face and Ron DeSantis in a military uniform and Ron DeSantis in a jet plane and, you know, all that kind of. He was not a pilot. He was a JAG officer. He was a military lawyer who worked at Guantanamo and watched and laughed while people were being tortured. But, you know, in any case, they're presenting him as some kind of military hero. That was the first one. The second one was equally bizarre, and toward the end of it, it had this I forget, Sonnenfeld, or whatever the last part of that word is. Sonnen means sun, and it's a giant circular orange sun with fragments of swastikas rotating around it, around Ron DeSantis' head. It's literally Nazi iconography. It's an ancient Buddhist symbol that the Nazis appropriated along with the swastika, which was also an ancient Buddhist symbol. And when these two ads came out, these two television ads came out, the DeSantis campaign said, oh, we didn't do this. These were independent private groups that were pushing these things out. So, you know, yes, they're offensive, but they might be effective, but don't blame us. This would be sort of like, you know, the Willie Horton ad. If George Herbert Walker Bush had said, oh, I didn't do the Willie Horton ad. That was you know, some crazed guy who, you know, pushed it out there. At least George Bush owned up to his Willie Horton ad, right? Well, now it turns out that, sure enough, it actually was the DeSantis campaign, in fact, leadership of the DeSantis campaign, that helped produce and approved these videos, and then they laundered them through third-party influencers on social media so that they could claim that, oh, we didn't put Nazi symbology and
We didn't do homoerotic stuff. This is just so weird. Ron DeSantis is like a weird guy. The more, it's sort of like, when in 2005, after George W. Bush got reelected, he went on what was going to be a 25-city tour, or 27 cities, whatever, in the 20s, tour of America promoting his idea that we need to privatize Social Security, turn the whole thing over to the big banks in New York, including the $2.5 trillion sitting in the Social Security Trust Fund. Just give it to the banks. And the more he spoke on it, the less popular it became, to the point that he just abandoned it after a half a dozen or a dozen cities. He just said, screw it. Every time I give this speech, people just get pissed off at me. Well, the same thing's happening with Ron DeSantis. The more people see, only in this case, it's not a particular policy, it's Ron DeSantis himself. The more people see him, the more they dislike him, because he's a creepy guy. He's a weird guy. He laughs inappropriately. I think he's, he's eccentric. Let's call it that. Let's not try to put a psychological label on it. He's just odd. And sadly, or maybe not, this is the best the GOP has to offer right now in opposition to Donald Trump. Nobody else is above 3% in the polls. Now, it's going to be real interesting. I think it's August 23rd, is the Republican debate sponsored by Fox News. And Trump is now saying that probably he won't show up because the debate is going to be among people who want to be his vice president, because he's going to be the president. And actually, that's probably a good strategy for him. I mean, why show up, right? He's ahead 30 points. Will a Republican who actually can take on Trump come out of that debate? This is going to be real interesting to watch. And it's going to happen in, 3 weeks? So get the popcorn ready, friends. All righty, is Trump's legal defense fund really a witness tampering scheme? I'll tell you about that in just a moment.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
18 minutes past the hour here on your media support group for We the People. Right back with you. And welcome back. Rich in Indianapolis, Indiana. Hey, Rich, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Thank you. This is a great program today. You really have some good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to bring an idea forward that just sort of hit me like a thunderclap. Yesterday, it was reported that the negotiations between union and ownership at Yellow Transport had broken down, and the transportation company Yellow was going to go to bankruptcy.
Right, to try to break their union, in my opinion.
Well, you bet. How about this as a response? Back during the Obama presidency, Timothy Geithner, as Treasury Secretary, ended up getting the moniker the car czar because he was empowered to save GM and Chrysler from walking away.
We actually nationalized them. We ended up owning the majority of their stock for a year and a half or 2 years.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that detail. All right, so here's the deal.
Nationalize Yellow Freight? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I would like for Yellow Freight to become a co-op.
Oh, interesting.
I think that the Mondragon model to allow the workers to control the means of production as a way forward. And second, how about then they electrify the fleet of all of that last mile stuff that they do when people are buying a portion of a trailer. That was something that was described for me that I didn't realize the company was this niche market for customers who need freight.
Yeah, my understanding is the way they do it is that you've got a truck that'll hold, X, and you've got
10% of X that you want to move on that truck. So you buy basically 10% of the truck. And then they find 9 other people to buy 10% of the truck, all going to the same city, load up the truck, off it goes, and then in that city they break it back out again into vans and deliver them locally. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the idea of all these different elements of the situation seem to be so perfect to be able to be knit together to create this progressive change for what we've got to save capitalism with. Because right now, the oligarchs that own capitalism have an old model that is this cultural hegemony that only gets them paid, and that just that disempowers everything else. Yeah. Literally disempowers everything else, even the unions.
I like the idea, but this idea of declaring bankruptcy to break unions is an old one. I mean, Eastern Airlines did it. If I'm remembering correctly, American Airlines did it. I mean, this was back in the 80s or 90s, but I was in the travel industry in the 1980s.
How is this different from when GM and Chrysler were playing their shenanigans with their?
Well, they were genuinely in crisis. I mean, that was that was the tail end of the Bush administration created such an economic crisis that nobody could buy a car. Yeah. And so you had these companies facing genuine bankruptcy. They weren't just trying to break their union. They weren't even trying to break their unions. They were just facing genuine crisis. But I think your point is well taken. I doubt that the Biden administration would take what they would perceive as that radical step.
Union works, man.
But yeah,
union works.
Amen. Thanks a lot, Rich. Good to hear from you. We'll be right back. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. So remember the John Durham investigation in which he said, the FBI never should have looked into Donald Trump's connections to Russia. And I'm scratching my head going, how can he even think this? I mean, the guy that Donald Trump hired as his first campaign manager, Paul Manafort had taken $66 million from oligarchs associated with Vladimir Putin to install Viktor Yanukovych as the dictator of Ukraine. $66 million. He took money from, he was paid $1 million by the dictator of Zaire, back when it was Zaire, to develop a strong relationship with Moscow. And when finally they threw Yanukovych out of Ukraine, that was in 2015, what did Manafort do? He came to the United States and he said to Donald Trump, well, let me help you, while he's taking money from Moscow. I mean, if nothing else, that should have been a starting point, a huge starting point for the FBI. There's a whole rant about this over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. Welcome back, 24 minutes past the hour. So Donald Trump had been paying the legal bills out of his campaign, his presidential campaign. He goes out and lies to people that he actually won the election. They send him millions of dollars. He skims piles of this off the top. You'll recall, this was the story last week. Jared Kushner set up a company that took about half of the $1.2 billion that Donald Trump raised for his 2020 reelection and basically redistributed it to the Trump family. But independent of that, his current campaign and a PAC associated with it have been paying for not only his legal bills, but and it looks like he's getting low on cash. He just had to ask. He had given $60 million to another super PAC, and he's having to ask for that money back. But also, they want to pay for the legal bills of all these people who could testify against him. But as long as he pays their legal bills, they're going to have convenient memory lapses. Remember when Cassidy Hutchinson testified about this before the January 6th committee? She talked about how the Trump lawyer that Trump was paying for had told her that it would be better for her and for Trump and for everybody involved if she just didn't remember a lot of things. See, this is one of the ways of getting out of a perjury charge. If you know of something and you say the opposite, You know, if you know that Donald Trump was watching TV and laughing during the riot, and you say, oh no, he was having a quiet lunch with friends, that's perjury. That's a lie. But if you plead memory failure, you just say, you know, I was there, but there was a lot going on, and I just don't remember the details. I'm sorry. And whether he was watching TV or whether he was having lunch with people quietly talking, I had other things to do that day, and I just don't remember. I'm sorry. And this is the position that most of these witnesses that Donald Trump is paying for the lawyers for are taking. Because, you know, most of them are not wealthy people. None of them are billionaires. I don't think any of them are actually even millionaires. And some of them who might have been millionaires for a while, like Rudy Giuliani, are now broke because of their own legal fees. And, you know, you can take this to the bank. Trump is going to throw John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani under the bus as fast as he can if he thinks it's going to get him out of going to prison. And the question in my mind is twofold. Number one, how is this not witness tampering? And when does Jack Smith start breaking that one down? And number two, how long are these guys going to go before they flip? What do you think?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with your calls in just a moment. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, talk media for the sane among us. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is the second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America by Carol Anderson. This is from the introduction. It was like a snuff film, that July 6th, 2016 live stream. Philando Castile sat in his car, buckled in, bleeding, dying. Why did you shoot him, sir? Asked his fiancée, Diamond Reynolds, pain piercing her every word. Castile, who had been pulled over in a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, because his, quote, wide-set nose, end quote, supposedly resembled that of a robbery suspect, had been reaching for his ID, but in order to avoid any surprises, let the police officer know he had a gun with him, a legally permitted, right-to-carry concealed gun. That was all the cop needed to know. Officer Geronimo Yanez began shooting. Castile's death came just one day after Alton Sterling's down in Louisiana. He, too, was carrying a gun, which was not unusual in this right-to-carry state. Granted, Sterling had a felony conviction, so owning a firearm was, for him, illegal, but he had been robbed before and wanted protection. On July 5th, 2016, the Baton Rouge police received a 911 call that there was a man with a weapon threatening customers at a local convenience store. As officers rolled onto the scene, they saw Sterling sitting there selling CDs and DVDs, just as the store owner allowed him to do and indeed welcomed. The threatening man was not Sterling. In fact, there was no threatening man. It had been a prank call, but that didn't matter. Within a few minutes, police had thrown the black man down, pinned him to the asphalt, and then started yelling that Sterling had a gun. He did. It was in his pocket where he could hardly reach it, what with the officers squatting on both his legs and one arm. Nevertheless, the police began firing round after round into his prone body, point blank. Blood poured out of his chest, but not for long. Alton Sterling was dead. The back-to-back deaths of these two black men police had shot for carrying guns should have jolted into action the Second Amendment's staunchest advocate, the National Rifle Association. In 1995, for example, the organization's denunciations flew fast and furious when it contended that law enforcement not only overreacted, but went out of its way to kill gun owners. Angered by the deaths at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, and the siege and firefight at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, both of which were sparked by federal agents serving warrants for weapons violations, Wayne LaPierre, the NRA's executive vice president, angrily wrote, quote, "If you have a badge, you have the government's go-ahead to harass, intimidate, and even murder law-abiding citizens," end quote. He further denounced cops as, quote, "jackbooted government thugs who have more power to take away our constitutional rights, break in our doors, seize our guns, destroy our property, and even injure or kill us." Nearly 2 decades later, that sentiment had not changed. This was evident when Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy
who had refused to pay over $1 million in fees for grazing his cattle on public land, summoned his gun-toting, self-styled militiamen to do battle with federal authorities to prevent the seizure of his herd for restitution. Richard Mack, a former recipient of the NRA's Law Enforcement Officer of the Year award, asserted, "If federal agents are going to start killing people, I'm sorry, but to show the world how ruthless these people are, women and children need to be placed in the front lines as human shields." Mack didn't flinch as he insisted, quote, "Women need to be the first ones shot. I would have put my own wife or daughter there on the front lines, and I would have been a screaming bloody murder to watch them die," end quote. Larry Pratt, a speaker at the NRA's 2014 National Convention, commenting on the fact that Bundy, quote, backed them, the Bureau of Land Management agents, down with automatic rifles and other deadly weaponry, proudly called that armed confrontation, quote, "a proper, legitimate, lawful response to illegitimate, unlawful exercise of government power, particularly on the federal level," end quote. Yet how quickly the NRA's swagger disappeared when government agents gunned down Philando Castile and Alton Sterling for merely carrying guns. Sterling's death didn't even merit acknowledgement. As for Castile, the NRA broke its silence only after inordinate pressure from African-American members led the gun manufacturers' lobby to issue a tepid statement that the Second Amendment was applicable, quote, regardless of race, religion, or sexual orientation. When pressed further by many of its members to stand up for Castile, the often fierce organization demurred, saying it was, quote, important for the NRA not to comment while the investigation is ongoing. This situational silence did not go unnoticed. The NRA had not only loudly defended the rights of those at the Branch Davidian cult and at Ruby Ridge, men who had actually shot and killed members of law enforcement, but the organization had also doubled down on calling for more guns in the face of mass shootings in a public school in Newtown, Connecticut, and a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Yet here, the guardian of the Second Amendment was now deliberately ignoring the inconvenient fact that black men had been killed for merely possessing a firearm. "Where's the NRA?" asked journalist Hannah Kozlowska. "Didn't Sterling and Philando Castile have Second Amendment rights too?" David Graham in The Atlantic coolly observed that, quote, "Two shootings give a strong sense that the Second Amendment does not apply to black Americans the same way it does to white Americans," end quote. Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson wrote that he saw the old Jim Crow whites only sign plastered above the Second Amendment. The book, The Second, by Carol Anderson. Hey, if you like the rants that I open the show with every day, they're typically published over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. And welcome back. Boy, a lot going on in the world today, huh? Okay, let's pick up your calls here. Dustin in Wichita. Dustin, I'll take your call, and then I've got this story about the Trump legal defense. What's up, Dustin? What's on your mind today?
Hi, I was calling about like the lady who was talking about like the I think in Porcupine Mountains. She says like the military may name calls our enemies, which yeah, I understand why they do it because well they're the enemies. We have
well, you're being conditioned to kill.
Sure that,
I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, somewhat.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there are enemies, and yeah, that's part of the military culture.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I totally get it. If you're going to train young people to go out and kill other people, and sadly that is sometimes necessary, there has to be a certain element of dehumanization in there, or they're not going to be willing to pull the triggers.
I mean, yeah, because we all just want to try and live together, but unfortunately there's just the governments or cultures that do not wish to live at peace, and we have to put that down. Yeah, and that's why it's so important that we limit that to the military, that we not do that in civilian life, and that we not do that in our political dialogue. Exactly. So I do have a question. I've heard you may call some right-wingers and people on the right Nazis and white supremacists. Mm-hmm. Now, if it's wrong for the military to name call, why is it okay for you to name call? Well, I don't know of any animals that are called
Nazis or white supremacists. Nazism and white supremacy are political ideologies. And, you know, just like Republican or Democrat or socialist or communist. And I'm perfectly happy if you want to call me a democratic socialist, you know, go ahead. But I'm not a communist. You know, you've got all these Republicans out there. I just, you know, quoted Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, calling Democrats communists, or calling individuals who are Democrats communists. Well, they're not. So I'd say that's wrong name calling. But the thing that I'm more concerned about is Donald Trump referring to people from south of the border as vermin, as animals, referring to a judge as a rat. I mean, this is the dehumanizing language that leads to things like stochastic terrorism, that leads to things like people trying to assassinate other people.
Stochastic terrorism?
Yeah, stochastic terrorism is where a political leader says things to incite random people to commit acts of violence against other random people for the goal of advancing a political agenda. It's a thing. It's a real thing. And it's frankly what I think.
Would Joe Biden be a stochastic terrorist when he went in front of Independence Hall and had that ultimately hateful speech against right-wing people?
Well, what word did he use to describe them?
He called us ultra MAGA and Nazi white supremacists.
Well, is that not true?
I actually do like the term ultra MAGA, and I don't consider myself ultra MAGA, but I have had friends that are ultra MAGA, and they're all right people. In fact, one of my best friends, he's ultra MAGA, and he's a real hard Christian, and he doesn't like the fact that I am gay, but we're still best friends. And one other thing
I think you're making my point here, Dustin.
Gay bar, yeah, but whenever I go to a gay bar with my MAGA hat on, I've had it knocked off my head 5 times.
Well, that's because those people don't like your politics, but they're not shooting you.
True.
I mean, after Trump went on his Jeremiah ad against the FBI and referred to the FBI people as stormtroopers and whatnot, which they are not. You know, you had that guy go to the Cincinnati FBI office and try to kill FBI agents. They had to shoot him. They killed the poor guy. He got triggered by Trump. That is stochastic terrorism. That's what I'm talking about.
All right, yeah, we shouldn't be calling FBI stormtroopers, but, well, they are corrupt people. And one thing I always do like to bring up about FBI is the Waco incident.
You'll find corrupted people in every branch of life. But, you know, to say that we need to defund the FBI, I don't understand why why the Republican Party is so enthusiastic about defunding the police. It didn't work when a couple of Democrats said it. I don't see how it's going to work when Republicans say it. I don't get it, Dustin. You're a MAGA guy. Do you want to defund the FBI, really?
No, not the entirety of the FBI, because the FBI does do some good work by catching child predators and actual domestic terrorists, which they do deserve to be locked up. And I do believe that child predators who have offended, we need to bring back the death penalty for them. So there are good people in the FBI and there's bad people in the FBI, just like there are good people in the police department and bad people in the police department. Yeah. We should investigate the FBI, see which parts of it are corrupt and have been ultimately controlled by the Democratic Party and Joe Biden and Obama and all the New World Order people, and investigate them and see which departments.
The New World Order was George Herbert Walker Bush's phrase, not mine. That was George Bush Sr. said he was bringing about, you know, a new world order with his 1,000 points of light, his faith-based initiative, his, you know, whatever it was. But I get it. You guys are triggered by it. Dustin, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. It's always nice to hear from you.
And one other thing, if it's okay.
Sure.
And George Bush is a neocon, and he did push forward with the disastrous war in Iraq.
Yeah, he did.
I mean, yes, we should have gone something about 9/11, but it was ultimately a war for God, gold, oil, and drugs. Yep. And I pay my respects to all of our service members who died over there.
Yeah, 7,000 of them.
And thank you for anyone who served our nation. God bless you all.
Yeah, I'm with you, Dustin. Dustin, thank you for the call. It's always nice having a conversation with a MAGA supporter who is rational, and you certainly are. I appreciate it. Thank you. Linda in California City, California. Hey, Linda, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I heard a very short piece on CNN last night that said this No Labels Party already has $70 million.
Yeah, they raised that about a
And-
month ago.
Yeah, and they're going to use that to push alternative candidates, which could easily split the Democratic vote, and that's scary.
That
because
is the
it
concern,
could
that they're going to
result
have
in
Joe
a-
Manchin and John Huntsman as a ticket, a Democrat and a Republican, and they will run, and they will pull votes away from Joe Biden. Now it turns out that of that $70 million, a very, very large chunk of it came from billionaires who generally support or almost exclusively support Republicans. So this is clearly an electoral strategy. And No Labels was started and run by a bunch of Democrats who were pissed off with the Clintons, basically. Joe Lieberman, and I'm forgetting the names of the two people who are the actual leaders. It's a man and a woman. But they were political strategists who got fired by the Clintons, and they've been pissed off with the Democrats ever since. And so it's kind of a revenge move. It's very sad, Linda. It's pathetic.
Coverage, though. This is dangerous,
Yeah.
and I don't hear anybody else talking about it.
Yeah, well, no, there is a lot of conversation about it, but you're absolutely right. I've talked about it before on this program, and we'll just keep an eye on it and see how it plays out. Linda, thank you for the call. Nina in Colorado Springs. Hey, Nina, what's on your mind today?
Hi, yes, Labor 411 recently, I don't know how recently, but they posted that self-checkout is bad for Social Security and Medicare and other social programs because there's no employee there to pay into payroll tax, and also the employer does not have to pay into payroll tax. So it's another way to diminish Social Security and other social programs. And I don't think many Americans realize this. And I think we should have something posted on those machines and have some legislation put out there to address all the automation that's rising, in the country and throughout the world, because it's killing our retirement. And I don't think people realize it.
Back in the 1870s, I think it was, or maybe the 1880s, there was a guy in Britain, his name was Ludd, and he led a movement of factory workers who were protesting automation within the factories. And they went into a factory and started smashing the machines with metal poles. His followers were called Luddites. And, nowadays we use that label generally to describe people who are opposed to what some might characterize as progress. I mean, the argument that the companies that make the self-checkout machines would make, and that Walmart would make, is that
But it's convenience.
Well, it's not just convenience. Is that yes, there are fewer people working checking people out, but for every one of those machines, there's a bunch of people who had to design it, who had to manufacture it, who had to ship it, who had to install it, who had to calibrate it, who had to program it. That self-checkout machines probably are a net wash in terms of jobs because it's a brand new technology. But I agree with you, Nina. My personal preference is not to use the self-checkout machines. It's to go to a person just by way of supporting a person having a job.
Well, their argument, though, those are people with high skills, okay, that are calibrating it. There's a certain segment of the population who don't have those high skills, and so their jobs are being diminished.
Right, and that's who always gets hurt first when you start automating anything. Is typically
not only
the
that,
low-skilled
why
workers.
aren't Democrats addressing this? Because it is diminishing Social Security.
Well,
and it's not a convenience when it undermines our retirement.
Yeah, I don't know that it's diminishing Social Security. I would have to see a good unbiased study on that. But
Labor 411 posted it.
Okay, that doesn't mean it's true. Did they do a study on? Well, I'm not familiar with the organization either. I'm sorry, but I mean, it may well be true. I think bottom line, Nina, is right now the Democratic Party doesn't think that self-checkout is a hill that's worth dying on. That's not.
Well, maybe not self-checkout, but automation in general. Because if no payroll is being paid for self-checkout, it stands to reason no payroll tax or by the employee or by the employer is being paid to automation. Period, wherever it exists.
Right. But this is happening everywhere. I mean, this is happening. Tax preparation, it's being done by computer now instead of by hand. And so there's a lot of fewer people involved. You can buy a tax program to do it. I mean, there's no end to these things.
Yes, that's right. I mean, time marches forward, but we've got to do something in legislation to fix that. So our,
well,
our
how about
funding for social
alternatively
programs doesn't
coming up
diminish.
with forms of employment that are appropriate for low-skilled people, or enhancing people's skill sets, or both? I mean, it seems to me like we need to be looking forward and figuring out ways to move forward into a good future rather than trying to hold on to the past. Nina, I got to run. Thank you for the call.
Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's 46 minutes past the hour. Back with more of your calls here in just a moment. And welcome back. Ron in Daytona Beach, Florida. Hey, Ron, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Great program.
Thank you.
I love watching your program, and there's nothing wrong with being called a social democrat.
I agree.
Nothing at all.
I agree.
Okay, let me ask you this question. Do you think DeSantis could be on the spectrum?
I think it's possible, but I'm really reluctant to label him that way.
I'm not diagnosing or anything. I'm just
my concern is that might reflect poorly on people on the spectrum, and I don't want to do that.
Now that's funny.
I mean, I may well be one of them.
Funny.
I don't know, but
well.
So.
Well, look at the thing. He doesn't like people. What kind of a rational person would take on Disney?
Yeah.
He's attacked the teachers' unions down here in Florida.
What? None of that stuff says that he's on the spectrum. That stuff says he has bad judgment and bizarre view of the world. I mean, the part about not relating to people, not being able to actually interact with people in a meaningful way, that might argue that he's on the spectrum. But I think it's we should let him have his own psychology, whatever it is. If he's concerned about it affecting his life, he needs to see a therapist.
Well, here's the thing: would you vote for somebody on the spectrum?
Probably, if I like their policies.
Okay, well, I would too if they come out and say it. But he's attacked applied behavior analysis here in Florida for kids that are on the spectrum to get treatment.
Oh, really?
He's actually put laws in to make it harder to get their treatment. So the other thing I just want real quick, do you think the Christian fundamentalists and the MAGA want Sharia law here in the United States?
Well, that's what they say. I mean, they don't use the word Sharia, right. But they want religious law that has the power of the state behind it, that has the power of prisons and guys with guns behind it.
Well, what's different than that than Sharia law? You just call it another name.
That's right. Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think that this is a legitimate concern. I mean, when back in 1980, when Jerry Falwell and Ralph Reed were hooking up with Ronald Reagan, who never went to church, just like Donald Trump, never went to church, didn't know much about Christianity, but he brought in his running mate's son, George W. Bush. They brought him in to build this liaison with the evangelical community. And basically, they cut a deal. I mean, the religious folks made a deal with the devil. They said, you give us government support and government money, and we'll give you votes. And, thus we have faith-based initiatives, which is just a fancy way of saying government giving money to religious people, to churches.
Yeah, and they're giving it to schools in Florida. If you're a parent, you can get tax money that we, the
vouchers.
FDE. Yeah, and if you're just a parent.
Right. And you can use those vouchers at religious schools in Florida. Or let me ask that as a question. Can you use those vouchers at religious schools in Florida?
Of course. Of course.
Okay. Well, see, I think that's as bad as what they're doing in Oklahoma. Ron, I got to run, but thank you for the call. It's nice to hear from you, and I appreciate the thoughts and sentiments. We'll be right back 10 minutes before the hour. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. So the witch hunts really began in a big way in the 1500s as a consequence, in large part, of the Protestant Reformation. There was this competition between the Protestant churches and the Catholic churches for who could be most effective at keeping Satan at bay. In other words, punishing the witches. And it became like a competitive thing, you know, it was sort of like Democrats and Republicans competing for your vote. Literally, seriously. In addition, there were attacks on women who were performing abortions. Most of the abortionists in that era were women, and they were being attacked for being witches, and that was because they were denying the feudal lords who owned the serfs and their children cheap labor, which was the children. So you combine these things, and you know, today we're seeing something very similar to both of these dynamics at play. There's a whole long rant about this over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. "52 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls. Greg in Fort Worth, Texas. Hey, Greg, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing? I like your topic about the dehumanization by the Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
But I was out walking, as I do for exercise around my neighborhood, and I saw a black flag.
Oh, really?
I didn't know what it meant at the time. So, as a black American descendant of slaves, I knew to cross the street, walk on the other side of the street.
Yeah. The black flag, my understanding is the black flag means I am willing to kill to defend my country or defend my beliefs or whatever. I am armed and willing to use it.
Does it also involve some kind of Trump?
Yeah, typically the people with the black flags are Trump followers.
Okay. And along with the dehumanization by politicians, I recall the Democrats, they don't do it as bad, but they will toe that line with Clinton telling our young black youth that they were super predators.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a tragedy.
And they need to be brought to heel the dog whistle.
Yeah. No, and the Clintons have apologized for that language, and you know, it was the time, but I'll just leave it at that. Greg, thank you for the call. Andy in Tacoma, Washington. Hey, Andy, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, thanks for taking my call. You seem to have touched on the subject a couple of times back with the religion in schools and being paid for by public money. Mm-hmm. And you had a little rant right after that, and you were describing the state of Utah. And I'm like, it seems like it's the elephant in the room in a lot of these conversations.
How so? What am I missing?
Don't talk about. What's that?
What am I missing here? What do you mean?
Well, Utah is basically a state that's run by a religion, by Mormons. Yeah, I mean, we've had guests. We run an inn here in Tacoma, and we've had guests from Utah, and I've talked to them about this. One was actually a school teacher, and it's just crazy how much all of the curriculum, there's a lot of money that comes from the public money that's spent for not necessarily religious studies, but they're regulated on what they can teach.
But that's the key, though. I mean, are they teaching Mormonism in public schools in Utah? I don't believe they are.
Well, the state is run by Mormons. There's no question about that. You almost have to be a Mormon in order to hold any position.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. In part,
a tabernacle across the street from each public school.
Yeah, it's also the case in much of eastern Idaho, by the way, which butts up against it.
I suppose this comes down to, for me, it's always been kind of like what rights do states have, and that seems to be what a lot of the arguments are about. Is how much federal rule can be put on states, and are people's fundamental rights being infringed by Mormons controlling the state?
Right.
That's.
I'm not
you
hearing
can't-
from people who are not Mormons protesting in Utah. Are you?
Well, actually, that's something that's again, it's the elephant in the room, really. The states, the Mormons are the Mormonism is creeping up into Idaho. It's certainly its own
and northern Colorado too, by the way.
Sort of independent, outside of any, again, it's not like other, if you're a Baptist, say, living in Arkansas. It's not like that. There's a whole, a government of Mormons.
Right.
So it's.
But that doesn't mean that it's a government that is Mormon. It's just a government made up of people who are Mormons. And I'm, in some ways, I have a lot of respect for the Mormon religion. They're a heavy focus on family and faith and all that kind of stuff. Right. On the other hand, it can be a little, far more cultish than I would find comfortable. But for people who are looking for family and community, it seems like I don't know. I'll leave it at that. Andy, thank you for the call. I'm sorry I don't have any, personal knowledge of what's going on in Utah, so I can't speak to it directly. Apparently you do, and I appreciate your comments. We'll be back on the other side of this break and want to get into how Maine is going to tell a lobbying corporation to get out of their damn state. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is the second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America by Carol Anderson. This is from the introduction. It was like a snuff film, that July 6th, 2016 live stream. Philando Castile sat in his car, buckled in, bleeding, dying. "Why did you shoot him, sir?" asked his fiancée, Diamond Reynolds, pain piercing her every word. Castile, who had been pulled over in a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, because his, quote, wide-set nose, end quote, supposedly resembled that of a robbery suspect, had been reaching for his ID, but in order to avoid any surprises, let the police officer know he had a gun with him, a legally permitted, right-to-carry concealed gun. That was all the cop needed to know. Officer Geronimo Yanez began shooting. Castile's death came just one day after Alton Sterling's down in Louisiana. He, too, was carrying a gun, which was not unusual in this right-to-carry state. Granted, Sterling had a felony conviction, so owning a firearm was, for him, illegal, but he had been robbed before and wanted protection. On July 5th, 2016, the Baton Rouge police received a 911 call that there was a man with a weapon threatening customers at a local convenience store. As officers rolled onto the scene, they saw Sterling sitting there selling CDs and DVDs, just as the store owner allowed him to do and indeed welcomed. The threatening man was not Sterling. In fact, there was no threatening man. It had been a prank call, but that didn't matter. Within a few minutes, police had thrown the black man down, pinned him to the asphalt, and then started yelling that Sterling had a gun. He did. It was in his pocket where he could hardly reach it, what with the officers squatting on both his legs and one arm. Nevertheless, the police began firing round after round into his prone body, point blank. Blood poured out of his chest, but not for long. Alton Sterling was dead. The back-to-back deaths of these two black men police had shot for carrying guns should have jolted into action the Second Amendment's staunchest advocate, the National Rifle Association. In 1995, for example, the organization's denunciations flew fast and furious when it contended that law enforcement not only overreacted, but went out of its way to kill gun owners. Angered by the deaths at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, and the siege and firefight at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, both of which were sparked by federal agents serving warrants for weapons violations, Wayne LaPierre, the NRA's executive vice president, angrily wrote, quote, "If you have a badge, you have the government's go-ahead to harass, intimidate, and even murder law-abiding citizens," end quote. He further denounced cops as, quote, "jackbooted government thugs who have more power to take away our constitutional rights, break in our doors, seize our guns, destroy our property, and even injure or kill us." Nearly 2 decades later, that sentiment had not changed. This was evident when Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy, who had refused to pay over $1 million in fees for grazing his cattle on public land, summoned his gun-toting, self-styled militiamen to do battle with federal authorities to prevent the seizure of his herd for restitution. Richard Mack, a former recipient of the NRA's Law Enforcement Officer of the Year award, asserted, "If federal agents are going to start killing people, I'm sorry, but to show the world how ruthless these people are, women and children need to be placed in the front lines as human shields." Mack didn't flinch as he insisted, quote, "Women need to be the first ones shot. I would have put my own wife or daughter there on the front lines, and I would have been a screaming bloody murder to watch them die," end quote. Larry Pratt, a speaker at the NRA's 2014 National Convention, commenting on the fact that Bundy, quote, "backed them," the Bureau of Land Management agents, down with automatic rifles and other deadly weaponry, proudly called that armed confrontation, quote, "a proper, legitimate, lawful response to illegitimate, unlawful exercise of government power, particularly on the federal level," end quote. Yet how quickly the NRA's swagger disappeared when government agents gunned down Philando Castile and Alton Sterling for merely carrying guns. Sterling's death didn't even merit acknowledgement. As for Castile, the NRA broke its silence only after inordinate pressure from African-American members led the gun manufacturers' lobby to issue a tepid statement that the Second Amendment was applicable, quote, "regardless of race, religion, or sexual orientation." When pressed further by many of its members to stand up for Castile, the often fierce organization demurred, saying it was, quote, "important for the NRA not to comment while the investigation is ongoing." This situational silence did not go unnoticed. The NRA had not only loudly defended the rights of those of the Branch Davidian cult and at Ruby Ridge, men who had actually shot and killed members of law enforcement, but the organization had also doubled down on calling for more guns in the face of mass shootings in a public school in Newtown, Connecticut, and a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Yet here, the guardian of the Second Amendment was now deliberately ignoring the inconvenient fact that black men had been killed for merely possessing a firearm. "Where's the NRA?" asked journalist Hannah Kozlowska. "Didn't Sterling and Philando Castile have Second Amendment rights too?" David Graham in The Atlantic coolly observed that, quote, "two shootings give a strong sense that the Second Amendment does not apply to black Americans the same way it does to white Americans," end quote. Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson wrote that he saw the old Jim Crow whites only sign plastered above the Second Amendment. The book, The Second, by Carol Anderson.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome to the third hour of our program. So in Maine, this is a fascinating story, an absolutely fascinating story. I shared some details of this with you, although not the new update that I'm about to share with you, back maybe 2-3 months ago when the contours of this first appeared. Maine has two major power companies, two major utilities, so electric utilities. And one is owned by a company out of Calgary that's called ENMAX. And the other, Central Maine Power Company, is owned by a company called Versant, which is owned by a company based in Spain. So both of the utilities that supply most of the electricity to most people in Maine are foreign-owned, one out of Canada, one out of Spain, which means that all the profits that they make go back to Canada and to Spain. And perhaps more concerning, the people of Maine are a little PO'd about the fact that these companies are not investing the kind of money into the grid infrastructure that is going to be needed as climate wilding gets worse. Maine is not yet, to the best of my knowledge, experiencing tornadoes, but that kind of weather is coming, and flooding and drought and stuff like that. The drought, they're concerned about it. Let's just leave it at that. So the good people of Maine got together and said, let's create our own power company that we, the people, own. It'll be a not-for-profit. It'll be funded and owned by the government, and it'll be run by good, honest bureaucrats that we have a say in, and our elected officials oversee. And we're going to call it Lone Tree Power because Maine is the Lone Tree State, I believe. I believe that's their motto. I might be wrong, but I think it's their logo anyway. So anyhow, it's Lone Tree Power. And these two companies, these two out-of-country countries, the Spanish country called Iberdrola, which controls the Central Maine Power Company, and ENMAX, which is owned out of Calgary, they have put, let me back up just a little bit. So the people of Maine have this on the ballot for this November, this is August, September, October, November, 3 months from now. And the people of Maine are going to vote on it. And it's broadly popular, the idea of Maine having power for Mainers, right? Mainers having power for Maine. Hey, we live in Maine, we should control our own power. But these companies have combined $18 million that they're pouring into television advertising, radio advertising, and social media in Maine to knock down this idea of going with Maine having its own power company. The Maine's Ethics Commission website says that ENMAX's Maine Energy Progress Political Action Committee has also earmarked $8.4 million for this effort. Now, that's money that they're using to, lobby politicians as well, but it's in the hands of the people because it's going to be a referendum. Now, I remember well, living here in Portland, I'm in Portland, Oregon, and so we're just the city immediately to our north. Portland, Oregon butts up against the Columbia River on our north. And on the north side of the Columbia River, the city of Vancouver, Washington, is on the southern edge of Washington State. And Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon are kind of one giant economic unit. I mean, there's a lot of separation, but there's two major freeways, Route 5 and Route 205 that connect the two. And a lot of people who live in northern Portland spend a lot of time in Vancouver because it's convenient. But the reason I'm telling you this story is because here in Portland, Vancouver, Washington being one of the probably 5 largest cities in the entire state of Washington, they get a lot of television advertising for Washington state political stuff. And Governor Jay Inslee, who is very, very committed to doing something about the climate crisis, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I forget what year, I talked about it a lot on this program as it was happening, but he got on the ballot a provision that was a carbon tax, a tax on fossil fuels, 100% of which would be rebated back to citizens. So if your price of gas goes up 20 cents, you're going to get a rebate that's going to more than cover that. Because you've got companies that are going to be paying this who are not getting the rebate, but the individuals would. So, it would be a net positive thing for Washington State, plus it would be an incentive to use fewer fossil fuels. And it had broad support. I mean, it had support in the 70% range when it got first rolled out. And then the big oil companies came into Washington State, and like I say, we saw these on television here in Portland because Vancouver gets all of its television out of Portland television stations. So they were buying ads on Portland television stations to broadcast into Vancouver, Washington. And they were just lying through their teeth. They had this guy who was a former Secretary of State of Washington State. He was a Republican, but he never said that in the ad. Never once did he say, I'm a Republican. He was just I'm the former Secretary of State of Washington. And he looked like Mr. Rogers. He wore sweater vests, and he had this very kind of friendly face, and, a nice-looking guy. And he was like, Jay Inslee is well-intentioned, but this is just going to ravage the state of Washington. I mean, this is going to destroy us. It's going to make gas more expensive. It's going to ruin average working people. It's going to, he just, literally a string of lies. And what happened, because they poured millions of dollars into that advertising campaign, was Jay Inslee's carbon tax got voted down. Advertising works. I am the proof of it, right? I'm sitting here, me and Sean and Nate and Joyce and Louise and Chase and all the people who work on this program, we get a paycheck because advertising works. We're on commercial stations and they run ads and people pay for those ads because advertising works. So now in Maine, they're about to get assaulted by these giant power companies out of Calgary and out of Spain. And I'm telling you, keep an eye on this. This is going to be absolutely fascinating. The message that they're putting out, that the people in Maine are putting out, is that they can't count on foreign-owned utilities to upgrade their grid to deal with climate change. And the state's ratepayers, if they had their own power company, over the next 30 years, they would save $9 billion. That's how much money is taken out of Maine as profit by these power companies. So it will save them money and it will make their grid more resilient. I'm definitely keeping an eye on this. All right, that's story number one. The other story that I wanted to share, there's two others I want to share with you, and this one is absolutely fascinating. The argument that is being used for these trans bans, these gender-affirming care bans that are happening in red state after red state after red state, is that all of a sudden, there's all these young people who are coming out and saying, hey, I'm trans. I'm a boy caught in a girl's body or a girl caught in a boy's body, and I want to be the other. And that the reason it's happening is because it's a fad. It's called social contagion. This is the argument that the Republicans are making. And they're not making it quietly. I mean, they're making it loudly. Right? For example, in Nebraska, Senator Kathleen Kauth referenced this theory when promoting a bill she sponsored to prohibit all gender-affirming care for transgender youth. She said, quote, there is a social contagion going around. Representative Braxton Mitchell, the sponsor of an anti-trans bill in Montana, said the exact same thing at his own hearing. There's social contagion going around. Dr. Jennifer Bowens, a leading Republican witness opposing gender-affirming care, says that transgender identities are the result of social contagion. She said that before the United States Congress. So the journal Pediatrics published a study looking into this. Is it true? Is it that there's a bunch of young people who are coming out and saying, hey, look at me, I've just decided I'm just on the spur of the moment, or because my best friend is trans, I want to be trans too. That's social contagion. And they did a deep dive. And what they found was that on average, trans children
knew for 4 years, on average, before they came out to their parents. 4 years. Now, this is probably the neighborhood of the same time for gay boys and lesbian girls. That, you know, they struggle with this for years. They try to hide it or cover it up. They know that coming out is going to, you know, provoke a social backlash, and it might even be something that, you know, alienates their family from them, which is a terrifying thought. And no less for trans people. And trans people have been, you know, even more frightened of this. I mean, you know, we had gay lib back in the 70s and the 80s, and you know, it became acceptable to be a gay man, and then, you know, I don't think lesbians had ever been quite as severely discriminated against and hated on as gay men, because straight men like lesbian porn for some bizarre reason or whatever. But being trans was like the least of the least. It was the most outside the norm by the perceptions of society. And what has happened in the last 5 years, more or less, is that people who are trans, and this is a real thing, people, you know, and they know it for years before they come out, are not just joining a fad or jumping on a bandwagon. They're born that way. And they're saying, this is who I am. And the analogy, Aaron in the morning makes a brilliant analogy about this. And my dad, I remember my dad telling me this story. When he was in school, when he was in elementary school, if you were left-handed, they tied your left hand to your body during school hours to force you to write with your right hand. And in fact, 100 years ago, only 3% of people identified as left-handed, because it was considered a sign of either devil possession or being gay or being just weird. By 1950, 12% of Americans were identifying as left-handed. Because by 1950, now my dad was in school in the 30s, right? In 1950, by the 1950s, it was accepted that being left-handed was normal. This is the cycle that we're going through right now. Trans is rapidly becoming accepted as normal, at least outside of Republican circles.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Sadly, the GOP has decided that they need somebody to hate on. You know, it's the old Chris Christopherson song, everybody's got to have somebody to look down on, and they're going to hate on trans people. And welcome back. Scott in Seattle. Hey, Scott, what's on your mind today?
Tom, you and your listeners might remember me calling previously. I'm that cradle Catholic who's opposed to abortion, but also a bunch of other things such as rape, incest, child abuse, spousal abuse, child marriage, having to carry hopelessly doomed fetuses, and particularly I'm against having desperate young women having the law thrown at them. But I'm calling now to weigh in on the thing you talked about yesterday, Catholic schools and taxes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that any group that wants to meet, to worship, or do anything else that's legal together should be allowed to do that. But if they need a building on a particular plot of land, they should pay for both and the taxes to maintain the roads to it and all the other things in the infrastructure needed. Electricity and water and sewer service, fire and police protection, just like everybody else has to.
Yeah, you're singing my song here.
What?
You're singing my song, Scott.
Yes. I firmly endorse your view that none of us should pay taxes for services for other people to take and use, regardless of their belief. Separation of church and state is a very good thing, and for very good reasons. Thank you.
And I would add, Scott, I mean, you're a practicing Catholic. I would add that separation of church and state is a good thing for the church. It's a good thing for religious people. You do not want the state. Yeah. I mean, this is why James Madison vetoed his first veto as president in 1809 was to veto a piece of legislation that provided money to a church in Washington, D.C. to run the poorhouse that George Washington had brought into being with legislation during his administration. It had always been funded by the government. There was this minor religious revival going on in America in the first decade of the 1800s.
And so Congress sent this bill to James Madison, to President Madison, saying, we're going to run the money through the local, I think it was the Presbyterian church, we're going to run it through a local church instead of having the government pay for it directly. And Madison vetoed that and said this would create a precedent, was the word he used, a precedent which would be extraordinarily destructive to the church. Madison was a Christian. He was literally every single Sunday he went to church. He was a believing, practicing. I forget whether he was Presbyterian or Congregationalist, but he was one or the other. And he was very into it. And he did not want his church to be polluted and affected and what's the word? Influenced by government money. He saw that as a great evil. So, I mean, I would think that any religious person would not want the state involved in their religion. I realize that, there's a bunch of, the Pat Robertsons and the Jerry Falwells and whatnot who have their hands out and want all the federal money they can get. But I think they're the exception. I don't think they're the rule.
Could I conclude with a very old remark by Jesus? Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.
Amen. Yep. And
Thank you, Tom.
That's what he said to was it a centurion who came and asked him, whose picture is on this coin and should I tithe or something? I don't remember the whole story, but yeah. Scott, brilliant. Thank you very much. Spot on. And thanks for listening to KBCS. It's 22 minutes past the hour. I'll be back in 60 seconds with more of the news of the day and your calls. Stay with us. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. So James Comer is the guy who's desperately looking for Hunter Biden, right? I mean, we've got to find some proof that Hunter Biden involved Joe Biden in a bribery scheme and they took millions of dollars from Burisma, this energy company in Ukraine, corruptly. And apparently Hunter actually was running kind of a scam. His business partner, Devin Archer, who, by the way, is a convicted felon now, testified behind closed doors yesterday at the House of Representatives for James Comer's committee, his House Oversight Committee, that is trying to find proof of this. And last night, Comer went on TV with Hannity, and Hannity said, are you going to be able to, he said, here's the actual question. He said, will you both, A, answer yes or no? Do you believe this is now officially the Joe Biden bribery allegation? Do you believe you can prove that, Jim Comer? And Comer said, I sure hope so. And I do believe there's a lot of smoke, and where there's smoke, there's fire. Right. So what Joe Biden has said is that he never discussed business with his son. He had some 20 phone calls with his son, Hunter, most of them initiated by Hunter. And many of them, we now learn, while Hunter was with people from Burisma, people that he wanted to believe that he had influence over his father. And he would call up his dad and put him on speakerphone, and Joe Biden would say, hey, how's the weather there? I mean, literally, that's all Biden would talk about was, how's the weather? How's your family? How you doing? What's up? But he absolutely refused to discuss any business whatsoever. And in fact, that's what the witness yesterday testified to. Representative Andy Biggs, one of the guys who wanted to help Donald Trump overthrow the government. This is as MAGA as you can get, Andy Biggs, who was in that meeting, said yesterday after the meeting, he said, Joe Biden did not know anything
about his son's business. This was 5 hours of testimony in which Archer testified on this. Archer also said, this is from a story, this is from Yahoo News. Archer also said President Biden met and spoke with his son's international business associates several times as Hunter Biden tried to boost his business, but he did not discuss any business. Now, this is the testimony of Hunter's business partner, who is anti-Hunter now. He's with the Republicans on this. He said Hunter put his father on speakerphone to talk to business partners about 20 times over a decade, but never once discussed. Here's what he said. Archer was, quote, unequivocal and stated very clearly that they never discussed any business on those phone conversations. All they talked about were niceties. There was a hello, and there was talk about the weather or whatever it was, but it was never about business. This is Andy. Now back to Andy Biggs. That's from Dan Goldman, who was there in the committee room, but he's a Democrat. Back to Andy Biggs, the Republican, who is, by the way, pushing for the impeachment of Joe Biden. This is what he told reporters last night. He acknowledged that Archer had no information on these unverified claims that the Bidens accepted bribes. This is the verbatim quote from Andy Biggs. Quote, he did not know anything about it. Bingo. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Up next, your calls here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Fair and only slightly unbalanced. Stay with us. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Stokely, A Life by Peniel E. Joseph. This is from the preface. Stokely Carmichael is a troubling icon of America's civil rights years. His Black Power call became a national Rorschach test. Whereas many blacks viewed it as righteous, many whites saw violent foreboding. Newspapers brooded over Carmichael's words, quickly forming a consensus that judged the slogan to be at best intemperate and at worst a blatant call for anti-white violence and reverse racism. In 1966, Black Power reverberated around the world, galvanizing blacks, outraging whites, and inspiring a cross-section of ethnic and racial minorities. In 1969, Carmichael left the United States for Conakry, Guinea, where he reinvented himself as a roving Pan-Africanist organizer and professional revolutionary. For the next 30 years, he remained an energetic dissident, a throwback to the heady years of the 1960s. Carmichael turned the quest for black political power into his life's work. His faith in a style of politics many considered anachronistic came out of the same tenacity and stubbornness that once made him one of the most effective and controversial activists of his generation. These same qualities, however, limited Carmichael's efforts as a Pan-Africanist political mobilizer. Before leaving America, Stokely resigned as Black Power's glamorous enfant terrible. Telegenic, brash, equal parts angry and gregarious. Whether dressed in three-piece suits, leather jackets, sharecroppers' overhauls, or African dashikis, Carmichael became to represent the era's multifaceted identity, a hipster hero whose easy grace allowed him to consort effortlessly with both the dignified and the damned. The name Stokely Carmichael first came into my consciousness when I was a young boy coming of age in New York City. As the proud son of a Haitian mother who belonged to local 1199 Hospital Workers Union, part of SEIU, I grew up hearing stories of how civil rights activists, Black Power revolutionaries, Pan-Africanist freedom fighters, and trade unionists helped to shape a new world in America and beyond. By the time I was in elementary school, I was on my first picket line, accompanying my mother in support of an 1199 strike. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King supported 1199 during the 1960s. Stokely Carmichael's political importance came into sharper focus when I was in junior high after the premiere of the landmark PBS documentary series Eyes on the Prize, which featured the 24-year-old Carmichael's fiery Black Power speech and rightly characterized Stokely as his generation's heir to Malcolm X. Over the course of a decade of research on Carmichael, I would come to understand him as that and much more. Carmichael's youth, casual dress, and charisma made him an easily identifiable hero, one whose quick smile and passionate speeches left an indelible impression. An adopted son of the South by way of Trinidad, the Bronx, and Harlem, Stokely adapted to while transforming whatever environment he encountered. As a native New Yorker growing up in the city's tense racial climate of the 1980s, I found Carmichael's survival instincts appealing. As a young graduate student in Philadelphia, I had the opportunity to hear him speak and briefly met him afterward. He encouraged me to stay committed to the Black freedom movement, a struggle he defined as infinite. With his flowing African robes, gray hair, and white beard, he looked like a prince. And he had changed his name. He was no longer Stokely Carmichael. As Malcolm Little had become Malcolm X and later El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, Stokely had become Kwame Ture. It was a name that paid homage to his two African heroes, men who had been the first presidents of their countries, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Guinea's Sékou Touré. Kwame Ture spelled the Guinean's name not as the French did, as white Europeans did, but as Arabs and Muslims did. Sékou Touré, S-E-K-U-T-U-R-E. As a college student, Carmichael helped transform America by organizing sit-ins, demonstrations, and voter registrations during the Civil Rights Movement's heroic years, a period that roughly encompasses the decade between the 1954 Brown v. Board Supreme Court decision, desegregation decision, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and has become enshrined in public memory through national holidays, films, commemorations, and monuments. Carmichael's deep sense of justice contributed to his evolution into Kwame Ture, the Pan-Africanist revolutionary and anti-capitalist organizer who moved to West Africa and remained tenacious in the face of searing political setbacks. Carmichael ultimately judged America incapable of creating the free and just world he had struggled for as a young man. But despite living in Africa for the final 30 years of his life, Carmichael's legendary stature as a Black Power activist lingered even if many ignored his lasting contributions to civil rights struggles that included a bruising quest for the vote in the Deep South. Although today largely forgotten, Stokely Carmichael remains one of the protean figures of the 20th century, a revolutionary who passionately believed in self-defense and armed rebellion, even as he revered nonviolence. The book Stokely, A Light, by Peniel L. Joseph. From international trade policy to immigration policy to housing, we've got all kinds of topics. The wars between Republicans and Democrats, the Republican efforts to induce fascism in the United States. A great selection of opinions will be found over at HartmannReport.com. Welcome back to the last half hour of the program today. Wow, time flies, doesn't it? All righty, let's pick up your phone calls. Linda in California City, California. Hey, Linda, what's on your mind today? Linda, listening on Talk Left app. Going once, going twice. Our call screener generally tells you to listen to your phone, not to the TV or radio or whatever, because there is a time delay so that we can bleep obscenities. So anyhow, let's try John in Los Angeles. Hey, John, you're on the air. What's up?
Afternoon. How are you?
Good. What's up?
I wanted to talk about the trend that's going on in Texas and Florida with whitewashing and trying to sanitize American history to make it more palatable for some.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, here's a question, John. Is the DeSantis campaign to whitewash American history, is that being done to make it more friendly and palatable to white supremacists, or is that being done to reduce empathy for black people? Those are very different things.
That's a good question. Only white people can answer that.
Yeah. Well, I think only Ron DeSantis can answer that, but it has the effect of doing both.
Well, no, it's white people that have to answer for that. What are they, what are their views?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on?
Yeah.
What's going on in America to make it more powerful? You keep hearing, well, little white children will be upset. They'll be offended at their history. Well, this is factual.
Yeah.
You cannot rewrite history.
See, I think the real message is they're trying to say, what are you complaining about? I mean, that's essentially what they're trying to say.
Right. That's part of it. But you see this trend happening over the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Mm.
There's an emboldenment.
Yeah.
Where you have people out marching in the streets. Jews will not replace us with tiki torches in public, with masks on. This is the climate that has been here recently and raised its head over the past 6, 7, 8 years. What's going on with telling the truth?
Yep.
Tell the truth about American history, all of it. Why is there such pushback from a segment of society?
I'm all in favor of telling the truth, John. All in favor of it.
But why is there such pushback from a segment of society?
Well, like I said, either they want to be able to, either they want to just basically whitewash the history so that they can say to people today, black people today in particular, who are still struggling with the consequences of 400 years of institutionalized both de jure and de facto racism. Hey, get over it. That's in the past. Let's just move forward. They want to be able to say that so that they don't have to address the harms that were done and the labor that was stolen and everything else. Or they want white children to grow up having no sense of empathy for the black experience. I think it's frankly both. But I really think that latter part of it is nobody's talking about. I'm sorry?
And what type of behavior would that be diagnosed as? Like a psychopath?
Right. Psychopaths have no empathy.
Psychopathic behavior.
Yeah. It's
that you're delusional.
Yeah. Inducing psychopathy.
Right? Isn't that right? Think about it. The slave owner, the slavers, what type of mental state do you think those people were in?
Yeah. No, they had a whole elaborate set of rationalizations.
They're rapists, they're murderers.
Yep. And they had this whole elaborate set of rationalizations that included, religion that they used. John, I need to move along, but thank you for the call. Your points are very well made. Thank you. Patrick in San Antonio, Texas, watching us on YouTube. Hey, Patrick, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Thanks for taking my phone call. How you doing, man?
I'm well. What's up?
So I'm looking at this St. Louis Fed economic data, and I'm seeing some alarming trends that are happening across the country to all of our people, all Americans. And it looks like 1.3 million Americans have filed for disability in just the last 2 months. And it's an alarming trend that we're seeing. And down here in San Antonio, I do have quite a few Republican friends and what you would call right-wingers and whatnot. And I'm always getting videos and clips of athletes collapsing on sports. This week it was this Wu Bing, the Wimbledon 23-year-old, and last week it was Bronny James.
Right.
And I'm just
none of which, by the way, had anything to do with COVID vaccines. There is a concern, though, that there are millions of Americans who have long COVID and people who refuse to get vaccinated. Or even some who got vaccinated and got sick anyway, because the vaccines aren't 100% effective. No vaccine is. You get the flu vaccine, it doesn't mean you're not going to get the flu. It means you're going to get a much lighter case of it, or you might not get it. You get the polio vaccine, you got about a 95% probability of not getting polio, but it's not 100%. The vaccines are not.
But we do recognize that the polio vaccine is nothing like the mRNA vaccine. The mRNA vaccine is new technology that has never been used before. And it
seems to work a whole hell of a lot better, because what it's doing, RNA, helps produce DNA. What it's doing is it's causing the body to produce its own antibodies to the, so you can use a whole smaller amount of the vaccine. It's a good thing. These vaccines are good, and in fact now they're developing mRNA vaccines for pretty much everything. This new technology works so well. But I am concerned about the levels of disability, and I think that most of it tracks back to a lot of it tracks back to long COVID. And I don't think that anybody's talking about this. You know, all the people who were essentially forced to work through the pandemic, through 2020, the bus drivers, the public-facing employees who got COVID over and over and over again. And the one thing we know is that, you know, the first time you get COVID, you got about a 4 or 5% chance of getting long COVID. Second time, that chance is doubled. The third time you get COVID, the chance of ending up with long COVID is tripled. Long COVID is debilitating. You know, it's brain fog, it's aches and pains that are unexplainable, it's absolute exhaustion. And now there was a piece in Science magazine this morning, or no, I'm sorry, it was in Nature. It was in the Nature report this morning or yesterday afternoon, about how the federal government is rolling out a whole series of new drugs that have been developed by the pharmaceutical companies and therapies, and some of these aren't even drug therapies, to deal with long COVID, because there are millions of Americans who are disabled by long COVID. And I think those numbers, I think that's one of the reasons why there's such a labor shortage. I mean, you know, Biden's taking credit for the great economy and all that, but I think that the long COVID is causing part of the problem. It is not the vaccines, Patrick. You can take a deep breath and relax. The vaccines are not going to get you. They're not going to mutate you. What they're going to do is prevent you from getting long COVID.
Do you think we should still mandate these vaccines? Do you think everybody should be forced to take them?
No, we stopped mandating them a couple of years ago. They haven't been mandated in a long, long time. In fact, I don't think that they've ever been mandated outside of people who worked in healthcare. I mean, hospitals used to require that, and they still, and hospitals still require people to get, you know, measles vaccines and polio vaccines and all, you know, all your normal vaccines, and that's because you don't want somebody working in a hospital who's contagious.
You know, it shocks me that you feel so comfortable taking a experimental shot that has no long-term data.
It is not experimental. It went through all the clinical trials necessary. It was fully proven to be safe. It has now been given to over 1 billion people. It is not an experimental vaccine.
It was Emergency Authorization Act. It did not have long-term trials.
Initially, but it is no longer an experimental vaccine. This vaccine has been out for 2 years. It works. It works effectively. And Scott, Patrick, excuse me, I'm going to end the conversation now because I'm not going to go around in circles with you about this any longer. Kill in Pasadena? K-I-L-L?
J-I-L-L.
Oh, Jill. Okay, that's a typo. No wonder. Okay. So Jill, my apologies. What's on your mind today?
Well, I am hearkening back, and I might have it wrong. I kind of hope I do, but in case I don't, you had a caller earlier who was talking about the Clintons using the term super predator. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, and I love you, Tom. I really do, and I love your program, and I love what you do. However, I think you said, and he said, you know, that you or one of you said that the Clintons did apologize for that, but then I was really surprised to hear you say, well, it was the time. And, you know, that phrase is used to excuse a lot of horrendous things.
I'm not excusing it. What I'm saying is that it wasn't just the Clintons who were saying that. There were a lot of people using that kind of language right across the political spectrum at the time. I was there. I lived through it.
All right, fine, but that doesn't excuse it.
No, it doesn't. And I wasn't trying to excuse it.
Well, I just don't understand why offering that is at all helpful. I don't think it is, and I think that you should just put a big fat period.
I think if you're going to condemn somebody's behavior, and their behavior was within the norm at the time, I think it's appropriate to add that caveat.
I don't know that it was in the norm. I don't know that the majority...
I was alive and politically well aware in the 90s, and that word was being used in newscasts. It was being used by Democratic and Republican politicians, and yes, Hillary Clinton used it in a speech, and she has apologized for it. And, you know,
and it'd be nice to hear you say it was unfortunate.
I don't think it was unfortunate. I think it was terrible.
Okay, well, you didn't say that, and I think that's important to be added as well to the mix.
All right, okay.
Otherwise, it sounds like you're just excusing them.
Yeah,
that's all.
Okay,
that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Jill. You said it very well. Appreciate the call. Joe in Portland. Hey, Joe, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
So many great topics today that I'd love to talk on, but the reason I called was to harken back to one of your earlier callers regarding Utah as sort of a model or at least an example of how church influences politics. And my experience with that is I lived in Utah for several years. It's where I graduated high school. And I was actually in Utah driving into eastern Idaho when that was on the radio. My concern with Utah politics is I think it's a very subversive model of church influence within politics. It's well understood that if you're not endorsed by the LDS Church, you're not a candidate for any office. They don't teach Mormonism in public schools, but they have a direct influence and sort of a overarching review of what is taught in public schools.
How is that different from the Southern Baptists in Alabama?
Oh, I don't think it is at all. I think it's more that at least again in my experience, the ease of association between state level governance and the Mormon Church is so entwined here that that they're almost synonymous with one another. One doesn't go without the other.
Right.
And that may well be, again, as you made the comment of in the South.
Well, one of the reasons Jimmy Carter became president was because he proclaimed his Southern Baptist faith, and that got him votes all across the South that hadn't voted for, that was not inclined to vote for a Democrat.
Absolutely. And so we absolutely see it there. I guess my concern is just, I think the model that the LDS Church has created within this state, their ability to reach out, I think back to California's original gay marriage laws and their attempts to fund against that law shows that it reaches beyond the borders of Utah.
Yeah,
and this kind of a model that falls within the constitutional separation. There's not an official declaration needing to be made, but it's certainly an unofficial declaration that if that becomes adopted at a broader level where we can all agree that, the evangelistic Christian conservative movement of the country today would love that kind of control that allows them to fly under the radar and yet still pull all the strings that they want to pull.
Yeah, if your message here, Joe, is that this is not a good thing, religion influencing the state, I'm completely in agreement. It's also a fact of life, sadly, across much of the United States right now. But thank you for sharing your experience with us. I do appreciate it. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
It's 48 minutes past the hour. Back with your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Andrew in St. Angelo, Texas. Hey, Andrew, what's on your mind today?
Oh, how you doing, Tom?
Good. What's up?
I want to say, first of all, thank you for taking my call.
My pleasure.
And I think you're doing a good job.
Thank you.
I want to point out something out, basically believe about the Republican Party. And there's a lot of negativity going on there. And I know you mentioned about the fascist part of it. And I'm thinking that it's something else going on with it that probably could be added. And you know how you watch these movies? They show you how the different countries plant spies in the country. They have families, they have children. I mean, it's maybe not their own, but they have all these different people, and they plant and they be up for years. And they start taking offices and stuff and getting position, and they be doing the business of whoever sent them over, like Russia maybe, But when I hear the Republican Party, as negative as they are, I'm thinking, I said, those people can't be from here. I mean,
are you talking about sleeper agents, basically? The spies who come over and pretend to be Americans? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like that's who they are because, I mean, all the stuff that benefit Americans, that we benefit from, so forth, and they trying to knock down or destroy and just. It just seemed like to me if they had family here, if they had loved ones, children and stuff, they would be concerned about their futures and stuff. These people act like they don't have nobody here. I mean, the way they're carrying on, it's like they're the only one here on a mission. And so I just wanted to point that out because I wondered if anybody else believed what I believe, because that's what I believe is going on in that Republican Party.
I think that what we're seeing is a sincere and well-funded effort by Vladimir Putin, and perhaps by the Saudis or even the Chinese, but certainly by Vladimir Putin, to cause Americans, particularly American men and particularly young American men, to agree with him that democracy is a bad thing, that a multiracial society is a bad thing, that the embrace or even the tolerance of people who are, not straight gender-wise is a bad thing. The entire LGBTQ community, and it's working. And the Republican Party has largely adopted these positions, hating on racial minorities, hating on gender minorities. And also, it was another article in the paper today, in the New York Times, I believe it was, about how Republicans, now that Donald Trump is openly taking the side of Russia in the conflict with Ukraine, and this is, Trump owes his life to Russia, apparently. It was Russian oligarchs who bought his properties and bailed him out when he was on the edge of personal bankruptcy in the 90s. Right. Trump is now openly taking the side of Putin in the Ukraine conflict, and the result of that is that a lot of Republicans are starting to say, the same thing. You've got 20-some-odd members of the House of Representatives who are all Republicans who are openly saying that they're going to refuse to fund any further military for Ukraine. And, that might be enough to really do some damage. I think this is being driven by Putin. So I'm not discounting what you're saying, Andrew. I think that I don't think that they're sleeper cells. I think they're, just people who are not well informed, who are being influenced mostly through social media and gamer venues. But that it certainly appears to me that that's what's going on. Andrew, I got to run, but thank you for the call. Thanks for watching us on YouTube. I appreciate it. We'll be back. It's 52 minutes past the hour. Stay with us. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio, and tag you're it. Right now we have the most extreme Supreme Court since the 1930s. And one of the main reasons is because these justices, A, have lifetime tenure, and B, in the 1990s, after a series of disappointments with William Brennan and Earl Warren and David Souter and a few others that have been nominated by Republicans, these justices tend to become more liberal once they're given lifetime tenure. So now we've got right-wing billionaires throwing gifts at them, emoluments, speaking fees. John Roberts' wife made $10 million, hooking people up with law firms. All the Republicans on the court are in on the grift. And it's really not so much designed to thank them for what they're doing, but to keep them conservative. Because in the past, Republican appointees have turned liberal. They're not going to let that happen. There's a whole rant about this over at HartmannReport.com. Check it out. Welcome back. Picking up your calls here. Avery in Antioch, California. Hey, Avery, thanks for listening to KPFA. What's on your mind today?
Yeah, I saw a mention in an article of a UN vote that happened in December of 2020, and I went to research it at the UN site because it's something that kind of complicates the narrative a little bit. It was a resolution to combat the glorification of Nazis and neo-Nazis. And I went through the list of the votes and charted it on a map. And interesting, and there are reasons why it was mentioned in this article. All of South America voted in favor of this. Almost all of Africa and almost all of Asia voted in favor of this, which parenthetically means almost all the Muslim world voted in favor of combating Nazis and neo-Nazis, so much for Muslims being anti-Semitic. All of the officially socialist and communist countries voted in favor of it. North Korea voted in favor of it. South Korea and Japan voted to abstain, and Australia and New Zealand and Canada and most of Europe voted to abstain. They couldn't find it in themselves to put an official yes on combating glorification of Nazis and neo-Nazis.
Any idea why,
in fact,
Avery?
Yeah.
Any idea why?
No, but there were only 4 nations in Europe voted yes. Serbia, Moldova, Belarus, and the Russian Federation. And in fact, there were only 2 nations whose ambassadors voted no.
Then you wonder if this was meta for something else. I mean, Putin has been, for example, I mean, I'm not saying that this is what it was, but this is a possibility. Putin has been saying that he had to invade Ukraine because it had been taken over by Nazis. The Volodymyr Zelensky, who's Jewish, was a Nazi. So it's possible that this resolution was introduced as a sideways way of endorsing Ukraine, Russia's aggression against Ukraine.
There were only 2 nations who voted no on this.
Yeah.
The United States and Ukraine.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so this was probably sponsored by Russia. Avery, I got to run, but thank you for the call. And thanks so much for being here with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us. That includes you. So get out there and get active. Tag you're it. There's so much to do, right? People to see, folks to enlighten. We can do it. We can do it. We got a big election coming up. Let's get ready. Tag you're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.